host, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're coming to you live again from across the divided states of America. I am on the West Coast, Jamarl's on the East Coast. We really do straddle those states. We're coming to you with headlines. We do that every morning at 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern. After this first batch of headlines, Jamarl's going to do his monologue, and then we will be taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, 202-521-1320. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. Last night, the penultimate night of the Democratic National Convention in 2020, Joe Biden Jr., Joseph R. Biden, Joe Biden, as he's known, is set to formally accept the presidential nomination tonight after last night, Senator Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination, becoming the first black woman candidate to accept a major party's vice presidential nomination. Former President Barack Obama harshly attacked President Trump, warning America that democracy is on the line in this election and telling American voters that Trump cannot live up to the office of the presidency. Trump soon struck back on Twitter in a few all-caps tweets posted live during the event, saying about Obama that, quote, and this again in all caps, he spied on my campaign and got caught, exclamation point. I honestly can't lie with him on that one. But succinctly put, I'll just say it that way. In our next story, Russia's main domestic political opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, is in serious condition at a Siberian hospital after he was allegedly poisoned. After boarding a plane, Navalny began sweating and acting erratically before collapsing at the back of the plane. He reportedly now requires a respirator to breathe while he's in the hospital's care. And according to his closest aide, Kiri Yarmish, Navalny may have been poisoned while or after drinking some black tea in a cafe at a Tomsk airport early Thursday morning. I don't know, man. The poisoning thing seems a little bit played out. I'm just hesitant about these stories. If however he's feeling, I'm sad that he's feeling that way. He's a human who shouldn't have to suffer indignities and serious discomfort and pain, the threat of death, all that stuff. So I don't know what's going on, but that the accusations that Russia poisons people hither and yon all over the place, they seem overblown to me. They seem way overplayed. Anyway, on to the next story. Iraq's new Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who came to power after his predecessor was forced to step down amid sweeping anti-government protests, is traveling to Washington today. He is expected to meet with President Trump to talk about troop counts in Iraq and about the country's COVID response. Facebook is banning hundreds more QAnon groups. They're also sort of suppressing, again, according to their own words, they're sort of suppressing or monitoring thousands more individual accounts, trying to limit the extent of QAnon's influence. For those who don't know, QAnon, interesting sort of conspiracy theory group, which views this anonymous dude Q, who apparently posts to internet forums like 4chan, image boards like 4chan, for instance, giving prophecies about the state of the deep state, where the deep state is going, says that Q is part of this grand conspiracy to save America with Donald Trump. Anyway, people who listen to Q and sort of say some of the, say that he's a real person who says things that are true, are part of this QAnon movement. They've been coming under some pressure from Facebook and other social media companies in the last couple of months. Twitter banning thousands of accounts back within the last few months. We'll talk more about this later. On a sort of side note, a related story, Laura Loomer, right-wing political candidate and controversial media personality, Laura Loomer won a primary in a district that covers Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort and was banned from her social media accounts. I hear that they had gamed the rules, that they changed the rules about which political candidates at what stage they could ban them, basically, for her to be able to ban her. It's interesting. She's controversial. She's claimed that some people who are involved in mass shootings were crisis actors. Anyway, controversial person. Again, we can come back to this wider topic of internet companies, social media companies suppressing opinions. Should they be? We're taking calls, 202-521-1320. In about 10 minutes, we can come back to that after Jamarl's monologue. Anyway, rest of the headlines here. According to a Senate report released Tuesday, Jonathan Weiner, a prominent Christopher Steele connection in the Department of State, reportedly deleted all of his communications about the Steele dossier in January of 2017 at Steele's request. Christopher Steele had previously told a British court that he had wiped all of his correspondence relating to the dossier between December of 2016 and January of 2017. That fits in with this timeline, of course. Weiner was also forced to walk back claims. This is coming out in the Senate report released Tuesday. Weiner was forced to walk back claims he made in front of Congress back in 2017 that he had not invited Steele to the White House. That's what he said back then. However, after being shown visitor logs with Christopher Steele's name on them, Weiner again walked that back, saying he remembered arranging meetings between Steele and State Department officials, but he couldn't remember when he had done that. So he sort of walked it back. Anyway, there's some potentially some ambiguity there. We were talking about Jonathan Weiner and APCO yesterday with Lucy Commissar. I might want to go back to that interview to check that out. In our next headline, a University of Illinois saliva test has gotten FDA approval. Students and workers at the school are set to get mandatory twice per week testing, which could help to keep the rate of spread down. Germany, meanwhile, has reached its highest peak yet, the highest COVID infection rate yet. And Seoul, South Korea, they banned meetings of more than 10 after cases there reached a new high. This is about, again, 5 months, something like that, 5 months into the crisis. In Seoul, in South Korea, a church, a fairly interesting, prominent sort of minority church had been doing most of the spreading. That seems to have carried on with hundreds of the facilities of the church acting as the sort of vectors for the spread of COVID. It seems like that's kept going. United States, of course, internationally makes the news because we are the head of the pack, but other countries still have their lockdowns going. Interesting stuff. I'm going to cut it there. I have one last but not least item, but I'll come back to that at 9 o'clock. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are the headlines. Jamarl, what is your top priority for today? What do you want to get into?
So let's get into Kamala Harris accepting the Democratic nomination for vice president. Fair enough. I accept it. I want to point to a few things, though. Clyburn, Kingmaker Clyburn, that was the one in South Carolina, the representative that apparently had the ear of the black community. And basically, when Clyburn gave Biden the nod for this, and Joe Biden took South Carolina, one of the things that Clyburn pushed was that Joe Biden should pick a black woman for vice president. His reasoning basically was Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, there's a lot of talk about them taking the black people for granted. And the way that they can show that he's not taking blacks for granted is by choosing Kamala Harris, an Indian Jamaican woman, and that it's totally going to make it work. Not to mention, regardless of whatever her identity is, it's also what does she represent? Who is she representing? And I hate to tell you this, it is a slap in the face to pick a black woman entirely because she is black, and it has nothing to do with the policy agenda that the person is putting out. Say for the moment, Joe Biden chose a older white Jewish man, and that older white Jewish man said, hey, blacks are dying 5-1 from COVID-19. You have all of these people that are ill, all of these people that have healthcare bills, 20, 30 million people out of healthcare insurance because of all of these people out of jobs. Medicare for all has 88% support. It has 70% support from the standpoint of the public. We need to push for this. Kamala Harris once said that, but then backed away from it immediately in order to get this particular spot. So did Elizabeth Warren. I'm making the point that it's one thing to put a black face and a black identity in a particular spot. It is another thing to have the person actively work in the interests of a particular community, trying to alleviate and ameliorate the hard edges that that community deals with. Healthcare is just one. If you want to go to the notion of criminal justice, Kamala Harris putting people in prison left and right, so did Joe Biden. They constructed that criminal justice system. And I would argue that part and parcel to the reason that he chose her was, yes, for issues of race, also for issues of ideology, meaning she's within the context of their ideology, but also criminal justice, because he wanted to push back against the Trump claims that they were going to defund the police and everything else. The argument that Kamala Harris is a great pick may be for optics, may be for certain political things, but if you get into the real nub of what the public needs, what the public wants, and what is in the best interest of the public, She is a performative, theatrical choice. She just is. If you wanted to be that theatrical, you could have picked Michelle Obama. And maybe she would have even gotten you more bang for your buck. Let's be very clear, though. The argument that Clyburn and that Joe Biden is making, that this woman, just by virtue of her race, is perfect for the black community and gets across that we are not being taken advantage of. And I'm saying it is the opposite of that. I'm saying she is a choice that will perpetuate the same system that has been going on. It's a new face, same continuity. Obama gave 95% of the income to the top 1%. Obama was perfectly willing to let homeowners go bust as he threw his body to protect Wall Street. While Obama was running in the race, what did he say? He would take shots at Wall Street. He would take shots at Clinton for being part of the individual mandate. Because if you remember, even though Obama pushed for the individual mandate once he got in office, when he was out of office and he was going after Clinton, he was hitting Clinton on a debate stage for wanting the individual mandate, saying health insurance companies wouldn't love it. What happened when he got in office? Individual mandate. I'm making a point to you that what Joe Biden is advocating for right now, whatever's going on behind the scenes, you have no idea. And the very act of him being nominated, the very act of him being chosen, and for that matter, even if I'm choosing Kamala Harris, you're stuck. Think of what Elizabeth Warren did for the moment. I'm trying to give basic politics. When you're in a primary and you have a lot of people who are pushing for your candidate to move in a particular direction, candidates tend to go to the left. Now, the media likes what they call a tack back once you get into the nomination spot, because at that point, well, the people who were the lefties, the people who really wanted you to do real things, well, those people are now trapped because it's just you and it's just Trump. And all of these ideas of lefty policy and everything else now can go away as you focus on Trump and Biden. And because Trump is so grotesque, the ideas and the things that Biden was pushing for before, you will forget. And by the time he gets into the presidency, all that stuff will be washed away, and Biden would just do whatever Biden does. And any leverage that you have in that process, up in smoke, evaporates. The argument that Trump is just so uniquely bad doesn't require issues of policy for Biden. So those aren't things that he focuses on. I make it just a very basic point. When Obama was running and hitting Wall Street, he was also having Wall Street, Citigroup, choose his cabinet. I'm making the point that just because they say something doesn't mean it's indicative of a reality that they're going to implement. 80% of progressives that were working in the campaign, meaning people who were on Sanders for the DNC convention, feel disrespected by the DNC. Now, I would imagine this was even more so when they had a litany of Republicans go strutting about the stage while giving AOC just a perfunctory introduction for Sanders. You are being disrespected. And from the standpoint of African Americans, this is not a giveaway to you. Did Obama, Blackness, stop him from getting 95% of the income to the top 1%? It did not. Kamala Harris, whatever she wants to call herself from an identity standpoint, identity is separate from what the individual does in that office. And for the longest time, the Democrats have put out this implicit idea that just because a person is black, gay, straight, trans, whatever, that they're going to somehow implicitly work in the interests of those communities. And if the person is black, that aspects of poverty and everything else, that somehow the black face is in and of itself enough to deal with those aspects. It's ludicrous. It's nonsense. Kamala Harris is just like every other neoliberal Democrat that was in there. And when she gets out of office, or when Biden gets out of office and she takes office, she will behave just like the other neoliberals that was in there. It's a change of face, but a continuity in regards to the issues of policy. And that, in no way, is beneficial to the black community. If you thought that blacks were being taken advantage of by the Democratic Party, even with a black president, why do you believe that a black vice president is somehow going to do something fundamentally different? You are being taken advantage of. You're being taken advantage of because from their standpoint, you have nowhere else to go. So they can put a black identity in, despite the fact that the black identity is not going to do anything in real terms for you or your life or to make your life better. It's a giveaway. It's theatrical. It's giving you something without really giving you anything in hopes that you accept it as if you got something to be happy for it. Kamala Harris, congratulations. And I would imagine there are a lot of people who are of Indian descent or Jamaican descent that are extremely happy. But if you are an African American in this country, this is a slap in the face. What you're looking for is policy, and policy to ameliorate your conditions. Let's come back after this. You guys are listening to Thomas and Stranahan on Fault Lines. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a regular segment called Criminal Injustice about the most egregious conduct of our courts and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Thursday and every Thursday for thorough and independent analysis of our criminal injustice system.
Fault lines.
And we're back. We're back coming to you live from the states of America, United States of America. We're taking calls 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Again, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, you're talking about Kamala. You're talking about some stuff, I don't know. You're talking about her representing the black community. I can't exactly respond to that. I can't speak to it from those terms, so I'm not going to try. It does seem, I was thinking about the identity politics thing for a moment.
Wait. You can't speak from it in terms of community, so that's fair. But from the standpoint of, look, the Democratic Party for the longest time has started, instead of dealing with things like economics or things that are intrinsically linked to race. I mean, I think you would agree that that race and class are often interlinked, and that they have taken this strident point of decapitating those things, meaning acting as if those things were separate from one another. Even when they talk about Martin Luther King, they talk about it from the context of somebody who was for racial stuff, missing the point that he's a socialist and getting rid of that part altogether, that he was a revolutionary. So I understand that. That's fair. But I think you can speak from it from the standpoint of where it looks like they use issues of identity to get rid of other talks of things that benefit those communities. And I find it to be a slap in the face. And they do it constantly. So I understand that you can't speak from those exact terms, but you can explain it from the terms that you explain it from. And you have your own experience in this nation, regardless of what color everybody does. So just talk about it from your own point of view. That's all.
No, of course. No, I mean, I have some thoughts about it. I was just right up front. I can't talk about it from that perspective, but there's some that I can. Obviously, identity politics. One way of looking at this. Again, we are taking calls 202-521-1320. One way of looking at this is you can step back from the United States and just abstract out for a second. If you have a society that by various means, through immigration or conquest, whatever, it's going to have to, it has a bunch of different racial and ethnic and religious groups over time, whatever.
Yeah.
You have to have some means to sort of reconcile those. And so, like, with the rise of nationalism, rise of colonialism, in the last couple of centuries, the way we viewed these things has changed. It's definitely it's shifted its form, but in some sense, this is like a millennia-old issue that empires or states or any civilization would have had to deal with. Is how do you sort of integrate a nation? It seems to me like the response from about the mid-19th century on was something like you create a national identity, and different nations had different identities, but there was a pretty like concerted effort on the part of nation states to create and to sort of shape, form, identify, however you want to look at it, their identities. And it seems that in the past century and a half, since there was that big push internationally, in America, but in a lot of other places around the world, but specifically in America, we have come to question our identity. We've come to question the grounds of the legitimacy of that identity, what it means to be an American, whether you should want to be an American, how you're going to be viewed for being an American, whether America as an abstract sort of whole that you can see yourself as a part of, whether it actually represents your interests, whether it's working for your group, whether it's religious or an ethnic or whatever kind of class group. There are any number of ways of breaking this up, but the point is if your society, if you don't feel like your society is representing you, you're not going to want to adhere to that definition, and that's going to lead to the division of that identity, of that group identity. And I think what you fall back on politically at that point is something like identity politics. Now, you're saying identity politics sort of causes people to be distracted, or is a political tool that is useful for distracting people from solving their actual deeper issues.
Yeah, because if you're dealing with somebody's body,
it's emergent.
It's like your
go for it.
Right. It's your identity of sorts, and it's like somebody is threatening your identity, but using that threat to ignore the economics and using that as a political, you can call it scam of sorts. Breaking these groups up. So this person, like, if I make an argument that all of us are united under class, and somebody else makes an argument, let's say Democrats, because they don't want to deal with that case because of the owner class, They would say, well, look, you're black, you're white, you're gay, you're straight, you're trans, and you're Hispanic, and all of these things are somehow different, and you must fight for those individual issues. Whereas really, all of you, the overwhelming majority of the issues that you deal with are issues under the idea of class. That is the one thing that Democrats don't want to talk about, and it is the reason why they use this kind of identity politics in lieu of dealing with those economic and financial issues. It goes against their donors.
By the way, okay, so we have, I could respond to that real quick, but I just saw 202-521-1320. We've got a caller on the line, Ingrid, calling in from DC. Ingrid, what's going on?
Hey, good morning. If you're going to be talking about Laura Loomer's being kept off of her social media, you also should discuss the Pacific Northwest Youth Liberation Front. That's the youth arm of Antifa. Their Facebook is now blocked, and they have been doing significant organizing that way, but I'm not sure. We can just see what you guys think about whether it's right to prevent them from having social media.
Thanks for the call, Ingrid. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. So just looking into it now, I'm not seeing major stories. PNW, Pacific Northwest Youth Liberation Front, billing themselves as a decentralized network of autonomous youth collectives dedicated to direct action towards total liberation. I'm literally just reading their Twitter handle there. But looking into it a little bit more, I mean, yeah, that doesn't seem. I'm pretty opposed to all of this stuff. I'll be honest. I don't think it should fall to. I open it up to the public for that conversation. So we're taking calls on that issue specifically. 202-521-1320. We're talking about Laura Loomer being banned from social media. Yeah, I
gotta be honest.
I am more at this issue.
I'm dicey on banning people from social media like that.
Yeah.
Unless they are actively saying, go kill this person, unless they're actively somehow undermining and intruding upon the rights of somebody else. Look, and I understand that this gets controversial. If somebody, let's say there's a shooting, let's say there's a mass shooting, and somebody comes online and says, this guy didn't do it, but the CIA and government assets came in and was really doing this, and look at all of the quirks and everything else. Now, every case, especially that's an emerging case, is going to have things that don't quite make sense, that people get wrong. And those things aren't necessarily indicative of it being true. It's just indicative of somebody getting it wrong, meaning somebody even reporting it. But, what did Mark Twain say? It says, a lie gets around the world before truth puts on its boots. And in this very situation, you could have, especially with social media, people spreading stuff in this kind of viral way where you get into a lot of people's heads that, hey, this was our government killing a bunch of people and blaming it on this guy. So it's like, how do you deal with that in real terms? Now, I think part of the problem is that at a certain point, your decision space, meaning from society and everything else, just based on the environment that you guys are in and the things that we allow and the logic that we work on, sometimes those things can't be helped. And it requires, it becomes like no good options or no good solutions to trying to deal with it just because your society has allowed certain attitudes, certain behaviors to persist themselves. And I'm not saying all of the behaviors are bad. I'm just saying they just kind of function that way. And so you get this kind of massive confusion of, what do we do about this? Do we tell them, no, you can't do this? Or do we say, yeah, you can do it, with the idea that this viral lie may take hold? All things being equal, I tend to fall on the side of, no, let people have their accounts. And if people want to watch those accounts, fair enough. But I am also a realist that there may be times where that may not necessarily give way to reality and things that must be done. So it's not easy, man. I don't, it's a free speech issue, but to some degree, maybe it's not. It's more of a human thing. I think it goes both ways. What do you think about it? I'm conflicted on some of this stuff, even though my bias is towards, no, if somebody doesn't want to hear the account, they could just cut off the account. They don't have to necessarily ban the person from speaking. I have qualms with that.
So okay. So you're right. On the one hand, this is a cultural judgment call. There's a bunch of subjectivity at play here. On the other hand, one way of looking at this, there's been a contradicting historical norms recently. We around the world, a bunch of different countries, but in America, let's just single out America. I think that historically, when it comes to, again, if you look at what we could have done, if you look at all the alternatives, we've been pretty good about allowing people to speak freely about a variety of different things that historically they wouldn't have been allowed to speak about. There's a sort of recent culture. The norm in human history seems to be a lot of opinions get suppressed. a lot of dissenting beliefs don't just get suppressed in a sort of tacit, cultural, implicit. That's sort of an unpleasant opinion and I'm going to avoid it and ignore it, that kind of thing. They get kind of actively suppressed. They get pushed out. People who spread them get thrown in jail. That kind of thing seems to happen a little bit more often than I'm comfortable with historically. That seems to have changed within the last couple of 100 years, maybe more recently, the last couple of decades, possibly. Maybe it's just my generation or something that thinks that. I don't know. But that seems to be a sort of valuable recent phenomenon. And it seems like we would do danger to that trend and all of the benefits we've accrued from it if we were to start doing this stuff as we're doing now with social media companies. I mean, again, the idea of the thing about social media companies being treated as a publisher versus a platform is significant, because it's not just attacking them for saying something or for endorsing something. It's attacking them for putting somebody on, for allowing somebody else to speak. And so if you and the problem is that when social media companies are coming down, whether it's on Laura Loomer or the Pacific Northwest,
Alex Jones was another one.
Well, yeah, but whatever side it's on, if social media companies are coming down on these entities, in a lot of cases, it's not because any individual group of people have complained about them. It's because they have an institutional imperative. They have some little group that they've set up that's supposed to moderate these things and suppress them. So it's at a certain point, it's a bureaucracy that builds up its own momentum, that's suppressing speech effectively. Of its own accord. That's what we're living in right now. And we would do well to avoid that. I mean, in some sense, I think if we just stay with if we stay with the uncertainty of, I don't know, is this right? Should we be doing this? There's some subjective nuance to it or whatever. If we stay there, aren't we just allowing that kind of thing to continue to happen? What do you mean? If we I don't know what the alternative is. Go for. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate to myself, because that's kind of how I act with a lot of these things, and that's kind of how I'm tacitly acting right now. But I don't know. Maybe I'm asking myself, should we do more, or should we take a more solid stance? No, this is definitely not right. Historically, we should definitely not allow our society to move back.
That is not easy. I mean, it's not. Look, reality gives us no easy outs, and the idea of right or wrong in this, I don't think applies. I think it boils down to kind of cause and effect. If you take a stance and say, look, there are times where your society is going to come in and say, you can't say this, or these companies have to step down on this, or whatever. There will be times where those people will be right, and you have a larger society that says, we don't want to hear that. Imagine for the moment if in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King couldn't give those speeches. Malcolm X couldn't give those speeches. Those guys couldn't get out there and give those speeches because there was no First Amendment that allowed them to do so. It's not that they were giving them free. They were getting beat, hit, attacked, killed, all that stuff. But there was an area of space from the standpoint of the legal framework that allowed those people to be able to make that point. Now, I think it's fair to say that the First Amendment is not an absolute. And you can't yell fire into a theater, which means that there are areas or gray areas where you start to kind of edge into that. And I think we're talking about the gray areas. All things being equal, I think both of us are like, look, let people talk. Even if you don't like hearing what they say, let them talk. I don't like, I can't think of the guy's name. He's gay, Republican, Yiannopoulos or whatever his name is. I think he's disgusting. Yeah, I think he's disgusting. Will I say not to let him speak at a college campus? No, I would prefer for him to make his case. I think if your world is a particular thing, that doesn't get accepted. I think if your world start going to bad ends, that type of speech gets accepted. And the catch becomes, why is your other media discredited to the point where this lunatic is not? I think that's the larger question. But beyond the larger question, you're still stuck in that decision space as it narrows where, okay, what do we do about this? And I don't think that's easy. But go ahead, Shane. Take it.
I mean, yeah, we've got to close out pretty much. I mean, we've got to go into an interview with Bradley Blankenship. We're talking about Belarus. Just last quick seconds on this. You have the public sector, you have the government, you have a bunch of different entities in Congress, you have a bunch of different members of the public really pushing these social media companies to suppress more speech. So you have a lot of that stuff going on. What does that end up looking like where corporations are being pushed by the government to suppress speech? We're living in that now, but if you play that out, if you think about that sort of totalizing itself, where you're living in a system that is suffused and saturated with that kind of activity, both by corporations and by the state. I'm making a slippery slope argument here, but I think that there's a case to make for it. If you set up a tool, if you set up a system, if you permit certain types of activities, again, the benefits accrued from those activities are going to reward investments in those activities, so they're going to perpetuate themselves. Anyway, this is maybe a little bit heady stuff, a little bit too heady for this early in the morning. We're going to come back to it later. Going into a break right now, talking with Bradley Blankenship next about the situation in Belarus. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Bradley Blankenship this morning. We're going to be talking with him in this segment and the next about Belarus. He is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Bradley, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks, guys, for having me on.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for having us. First time guest. Appreciate you joining us. We're talking about Belarus this morning. Specifically, we're talking, of course, about prominent, massive protests going on. That's what we hear against Lukashenko. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in Lithuania recently called for help from the EU. It seems very quickly the EU responded, saying they don't recognize the recent election results. That's about where we left the audience. This was, I believe, yesterday, most recent update. What's happened since then, and where do you see this going, Bradley?
So there's obviously been kind of a lot happening, and Lukashenko, some people are saying that he's folding on this issue, but actually he's maintained the position that he's resolute. He's not going to leave office. And this is the very serious political impasse that people in Belarus are facing. Basically, Lukashenko is what I would call stuck in power because the incumbent here is resolute. The protesters are not violent. A lot of people are comparing this to the color revolution in 2014 in Ukraine. That doesn't seem to be the case in my estimation because the protests are not armed, they're not violent. This seems to be, despite what some people are saying, I think it's a spontaneous movement against Lukashenko. The parliament is firmly under his control. That is to say that people agree with him, and there's really no constitutional mechanism to actually get him out of power. So barring any type of military coup, which I think would be the most obvious mechanism to get him out of power at this point, which is unlikely to happen, there's really like a severe amount of uncertainty here. And I think really what's going to have to happen here is that there will have to be some mediation. And as I said in my last column yesterday for RT, that there will be some mediation between Russia and the European Union. I think that would be a serious victory for European integrity, for multilateral institutions to function well. And I think that the Belarusian people actually will be able to secure an accountable leadership at this point, because, I'm personally not a person that likes to criticize other countries' elections, especially, when there's some marginal left-wing group or leader that's against U.S. imperialism. Certainly Lukashenko is that. But there are very serious reasons to believe that this election was fraudulent. If you look at the Belarusian media, there's dozens of cases of protocols at different election stations that simply do not match what is the reported result of this election. So I think ultimately there will be some kind of mediation in effect, but certainly, of course, with the Belarusian people at the forefront, and this is exactly what the candidate that you spoke about is Lithuania now. She said that to the European Commission as well, with the leader, Charles Michel, and the rest of the European leaders. So I think that there is actually a pretty good chance here, barring any U.S. interference, that this could be, let's say, a different kind of development, not so much a color revolution of the American nation building style.
Bradley, so what should they do then? I mean, look, I tend to be reflexively against these kind of interventions into other countries. I think they lead to bad ends. But if Lukashenko didn't win, and it's clear, if it looks like it didn't win, and he's like, I'm not going anywhere, even if the EU puts on sanctions, even if the United States bellyaches, at the end of the day, how does it get resolved if he says, I'm not going anywhere, and basically goes towards Russia for help? I mean, why wouldn't he? That's been the association, that's been a close link between the two. So, go ahead. I guess I'm asking what takes place, what happens under those circumstances if he just doesn't go?
Right. Well, there's serious reason to think. I mean, these sanctions are quite limited only to him and the officials that the EU believes is connected to the election fraud and the suppression of the protests. But I think that, he's already folding, saying that there could be some constitutional referendum, which could down the line lead to an election. I think he's buying time in this regard. There's a serious reason to believe even that could be a good option, because then it will maintain the Belarusian Republic, which I think really is not actually amongst the opposition's demands, which is to dissolve the Belarusian Republic as it currently exists. I mean, the opposition is so ideologically empty and not actually like a collective unit, which is why I think there's really a lack of U.S. Fingerprints on this spontaneous demonstration. The fact that it's not like fully infiltrated by right-wing people who are pushing for privatization and such like this. So I think really, Lukashenko seems to be now at this point, after everything has happened and, foreign powers have kind of shown that they are willing to at least marginally intervene from the EU, for example. I don't believe, though, that Russia is willing to necessarily prop up Lukashenko. They just want to keep the government as it exists, and especially its system of international relations under the 18th article of the Belarusian Constitution, which states that Belarus maintains neutrality on all foreign affairs and is not, going to give into this kind of like bloc, this Cold War era, kind of like bloc mentality. I think this is really Russia's their goal here. If they were to militarily intervene, it would be, I believe, solely to prop up the government, but not necessarily Lukashenko. And also, it should be noted that Russia has actually several claims in Belarus. There's a lot of military installations in Belarus. For example, there is the Volga radar station, and as well, Russia has a nuclear power plant in Belarus. So these are very serious considerations. If there was a neoliberal regime that came and was trying to take over these Russian military installations, I have serious doubts that Russia would actually let that happen. But I don't see that Russia would actually intervene to uphold Lukashenko as the president.
From what you were saying, Bradley, it sounds like you were saying that you thought the Russian Federation and the EU would effectively talk about who would be a better leader, not ratifying Lukashenko, not approving of him, but like you were saying, trying to replace him. But like you said, it seems like there could be one obstacle or one roadblock to that happening if the U.S. decides to get involved. The Department of State appears to have been mulling some kind of intervention, not just something like a sanction or a set of sanctions, but some, again, actual intervention, whatever that ends up meaning. Do you see that happening? Why do you think we would, for the sort of background there? Why do you think the United States would want to get involved? First off, you're talking about Russia's military interest potentially in Belarus. Also, obviously, the EU. This is a big battleground there potentially, but and I mean that mostly economically and politically, but also obviously potentially militarily. So there's that as far as why the U.S. might want to get involved. But also, do you actually see that happening? Do you see the U.S. taking that step potentially? What's your take, Bradley?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I'll answer the first one. Why does the U.S. want to get involved? You should just read like the columns coming out by a lot of these neoconservative think tank ghouls. They're pushing for privatization of Belarus. I mean, they want to destroy and gut Belarus just like they did the Soviet Union, leave the people of Belarus in total despair. It's quite obvious. I mean, this has been the goal that they've had for every government across the world, which is to destroy the very effective social institutions, privatize everything. and export American capital into Belarus to make money with people and so on and so forth, and also to encroach on Russia, which is a serious policy of the U.S., of course. The second part of that, is that going to happen? I seriously doubt that. Actually, Mike Pompeo was in a trip in Europe last week, I believe. I'm getting my days mixed up here, but I think it was last week, and he was actually here in Prague and was snubbed heavily here. The Czech prime minister in front of Mike Pompeo gave this rousing speech in front of the Czech nation on TV. I remember watching it, and he was just saying all this stuff about, the new battle between democracy and tyranny, China and Russia versus the United States, and whose side everybody's going to be on. And Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš said that, the Czech nation doesn't see a threat from these people, from these different nations, Russia and China. When Mike Pompeo went to Slovenia, the local media was criticizing him there. When he went to Austria, people were criticizing him for pulling out of multilateral institutions. The fact is that the quote-unquote West is not a monolith anymore. The Cold War that the U.S. is launching, especially now in the coronavirus crisis against China, against Russia, is crumbling. The multilateral institutions are failing because of the United States, and I think the world sees it. Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, in an interview after Mike Pompeo left, was asked about the situation in Belarus, and he was asked specifically, should the Czech Republic wait for a U.S. response? Should they follow U.S. sanctions? And he flatly said no. This is a European affair. This has nothing to do with the Americans. This is one of the U.S.'s closest allies in Europe, Czech Republic. I would say that the media and the public here is quite reactionary, but the people in power know that the Americans are only going to destabilize Europe. I think everybody sees that here, especially under the Trump administration. Now, things might be different under Biden. I think there will be a reset of transatlantic relations. But at this point, I really doubt that the Americans have the capability and the diplomatic power to really have a serious influence in Europe, especially in Belarus at this point. So this is why I think that there's serious potential for multilateral work here between the Europeans and Russia.
That seems actually, like you were saying, that the United States probably won't get involved. But if they do, it would mostly be to maintain their position as a diplomatic intermediary, as a sort of, the party that gets to decide ultimately how a lot of these things go down. It seems to be that seems to be what they want to do. Certainly, that seems to be what Pompeo is pushing for. But like you're saying, locally they're getting some pushback, so they're probably actually not going to do that. And then, like you're saying, that begs the question: what follows? Do you see the potential? What if our current international institutions are breaking down? Our current multilateral, at least nominally multilateral institutions are breaking down. What do you see coming up to replace them? Do you see the seeds of any of that forming at this point, or is it still pretty hazy? Bradley?
Well, do you mean just generally across the world, multilateral institutions? Well, I think if that's the case, I think they're going to continue, but I think they will continue without the United States. I think that, there's some reason to doubt here. For example, the European Union is not buying into the World Health Organization's COVAX plan, which is a very serious multilateral effort that should be taken now. As the World Health Organization said on Tuesday, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And unfortunately, rich countries, the European Union, the United States, are engaging in vaccine nationalism. So there's certain areas where I think there will be bilateral things with the United States and the European Union, of course. But in general, multilateral institutions, I think, will prevail. I mean, look at what happened with Mike Pompeo's State Department and the diplomats when they got snubbed at the United Nations Security Council about snapback sanctions against Iran. This was huge embarrassment. I mean, Russia and China didn't even have to exercise their veto on this. It was just shut down. I think it was only the United States and the Dominican Republic that voted in favor of these snapback sanctions. The fact is
that's the sad part. Dominican Republic, they're nowhere nearby. Brad, let me take a break. Brad, let's take a break real quick, and we'll bring you back. You guys are listening to Bradley Blankenship. Blankenship is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. We will be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. You guys have been listening, or we're here with Bradley Blankenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN. Bradley, I wanted to get into your optimism on this because I got to be honest, I think I'm a little bit more cynical. If those protests keep going on, and if the financial interest, which is there to privatize those industries every bit as much as they did in Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed, and those factors are there, again, in the Ukraine, they had no issue with going after a country that is on the Russian border. Well, Belarus is also on the Russian border. And from the standpoint of geopolitics, or these hawks, or from the standpoint of the privateers who also fall and dovetail with these hawks, if these protests continue to go on, do you see, let's say, an incentive from various hawks around the world to try to instigate themselves into those protests to make them more violent, or to try to destabilize the country that much more? And that level of brinksmanship, how would Russia respond to something like that being on its border?
Mm-hmm. So I'll respond to the privatization one. First, so there is definitely a huge push, I think, to ideologically influence this movement. Radio Free Europe and other State Department propaganda outlets are pushing very hard and actually leading a lot of the so-called humanitarian aid effort right now, and they're actually coordinating with some European countries. So clearly there is, like some U.S. NGO work, and they're trying to infiltrate this. But I think that the Europeans, who I really think are going to be taking the lead from the so-called West at this point on this issue, are much less committed to this kind of shock therapy privatization model. Now, certainly they are interested to it some degree, but I just doubt they have really like the ideological and serious drive that the Americans have. And as I mentioned before, I think the Americans will take a less role here. Now, as far as like if the Belarusian people themselves will actually commit to this, I think that's very doubtful. This is not a movement that's based against economic grievances. Belarus has a very, very, very successful state model. Its planned economy is actually what saved it from the suffering that, for example, Russia went through in the 1990s. Now, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Belarus, just like every other former Soviet state, had its very terrible period with GDP just falling off a cliff. But in the late 1990s, Belarus soared economically and was kind of like the envy of the post-Soviet states. To this day, Belarus has a very high human development index rating from the United Nations. It's in a very high development category. It has an extremely efficient health system, has a lower infant mortality rate than Russia and the United Kingdom both. It has extremely educated population, very good education. They have high doctor per capita ratio, extremely high
so
literacy
this is everything
rate.
to do with just the election, is basically what you're saying.
Oh,
like
no,
it's very
I'm
specific.
I'm saying that. Well, I'm kind of explaining here that the plain economy has worked, but there is some economic grievances that started in the past 10 years, and this is particularly relevant to the youth that I believe that Lukashenko has lost, and this is really the main driver of this movement now. So in 2010, the growth of Belarus. So Lukashenko, before an election in 2011, made the claim that he was going to raise everybody's salary to $500, which destroyed the foreign exchange rate of the Belarusian ruble. tanked the economy for a few years. And then in 2015, when the U.S. became a net exporter of oil, the crash in Russia happened from the falling price of oil. This caused a recession in Belarus, and we're still living within the context of that. People haven't seen their standard of living rise in Belarus. And again, this specifically has affected the youth. I think Lukashenko himself said about 8% of the country has actually moved out of Belarus and lives abroad. There's many of these people that I know in Prague, for example. So in this way, he's lost the youth. But it's mostly centered around the political grievances, the fact that there is little political representation in Belarus. Now, the Belarusian Republic has always been the most stable Soviet republic, and now certainly these people are still in office, these bureaucrats. Lukashenko has kept them around. It's a very functional government. This is not the problem that people have. People have a problem with Lukashenko's leadership in specific, and I think that here we have the problem. The only thing that the opposition has in common is Lukashenko out.
I see.
Now, your second part, you asked about Russia's interests here. Well, I think this ties into the part about the ideological emptiness of the opposition and why it's going to be so crucial that it's purely among the Belarusian people. I mean, if this is co-opted by the United States, and there's some talk about wanting to break the union with Russia, wanting to break out of strategic pacts with Russia, this would be a serious problem. I think Russia would intervene politically, never mind militarily. But actually, a significant part of the opposition has said they would not do that. They said that they want to maintain friendly relationships with Russia. And in fact, yeah.
No, sorry, I didn't realize if you had come to the end of your sentence there. We have about 6 minutes left, something like that. Actually, I want to kind of follow up there on exactly that point. Also, the cultural aspect of this from the public's perspective. Belarus, former Soviet state, as far as I can tell, this is definitely how they're painted by the West. It is the sort of last man standing when it comes to former Soviet states. Actually a Soviet-style planned economy, like you were talking about. Don't need to get into the efficacy of that right now, because that would probably come to dominate the conversation. But there are a couple directions I want to go here. For one thing, Russia and Belarus have been talking about a union state for decades now, and something like that, even if it's just a formalized alliance, not necessarily full political integration, that would make sense. Just considering that, again, it's a former Soviet state. It seems like it's to be, again, the last Sovietized state, both culturally and in terms of how the economy works. And even though Russia is very much not that, Russia has definitely moved on. It seems like that is the main historical entity in the region that Belarus would have those ties to. One, I want to go to you. One, am I wrong on that? And two, there's another side to this question, which is culturally, what is Belarus like now? What is the public's, as best as you can tell, what is the public's perception of the planned economy, of the Soviet-style planned economy, not just of the government, but of the sort of cultural legacy of this government that didn't go through lustrations, didn't go through the other sort of post-Soviet process that a lot of other countries in Eastern Europe did. What does the public think of that system itself? Not Lukashenko, but the system. Bradley.
Yeah. So I think I'll start with the second, because I think it really ties to the first. So you have to know that in Belarus, this is a country which, for example, still upholds Joseph Stalin. In fact, I have in my room here a medallion from the 100-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution from Belarus that has Joseph Stalin's face on it, for example. And I also have a friend of mine here in Prague whose grandfather has a mosaic of Joseph Stalin in his dining room, his grandfather. So these are people who are very much, I think at least the older generation, are very much committed to the Soviet Union, and in fact their appreciation for Joseph Stalin specifically has to do around his handling of the Second World War, how much tremendous suffering the Belarusian people went through during that war, and their eventual victory. So I think people, they really have a different mindset than Russians. Now, certainly they're very culturally tied to Russia. All the media is consumed in Russian, the music people listen to is Russian artists. There's obviously still a lot of cultural ties that people have across all the former Soviet republics, but Belarus is very distinct in this way that they have not, torn down any of the monuments to their former leaders and so on and so forth. They have maintained virtually the same, except, again, for young people. And I think here is really the reason why the opposition is so disparate in its ideological clarity is the fact that there is a significant amount of the opposition which doesn't want to be more like Russia and probably would like to join a union state. There's a significant part of them that would like to be more Western. And I'm sure that there's certain factions that are extremely reactionary, probably like religiously influenced and stuff like this. So again, I think this is the most fundamental challenge to everything going on right now is this lack of ideological clarity and a lack of general vision from the opposition, except for the position of Lukashenko leave. And here's the real danger. So I think this is the real political impasse that people face in Belarus. This is the real conversation, but I think ultimately it should be left up to them.
What do you think would be the best outcome? For Lukashenko to just leave? I mean, I guess my feeling is this. If you have, just because you have an element in the Constitution doesn't necessarily mean that that Constitution would be adhered to, especially if things go extraordinarily bad. What do you think the best outcome for this is? Just from your point of view and just from the way you see it. I would imagine you don't believe that this kind of helter-skelter privatization that killed all of these other people would be the best solution. But what do you think the most ideal outcome for this country would be? Would it be for Lukashenko to leave and have new elections? Would it be for him to stay? Like, how do you frame this in regards to what's the best?
Yeah, this is the difficult part. Well, I think the first thing, first and foremost, is that the desire that the Belarusian people should be taken into account. I think it's really their thing to decide. If I were to say what I would like personally, or what I think would be the best, I would definitely say that I think the Belarusian state should not follow the same mistakes of the Soviet Union, which is basically a stalling out of the political program, and then everything falls apart from internal divisions. I think that Lukashenko this whole time should have done more to uplift younger people, to make them feel more politically represented, and to really adhere to their needs. This is what he has not done. He's been in power now for over 2 decades. I think that he should be willing to hand over power. There should be a constitutional mechanism for him to hand over power to someone else. And he should be willing to accept that. I think that was the gravest problem that led us to where we are now. That's also on top of his recent problems with the coronavirus and various other things, not to go into those. But certainly the economic model of Belarus should stay the way it is. I don't think that there's a serious amount of people that would want to dismantle the planned economy that they have. It's worked for so many people. They have there's a ton of retirees in Belarus, people living off the pension system still from the former Soviet Union, for example. So I think my ideal situation that I imagine would be a multilateral approach to giving the Belarusian people the space they need to figure this out on their own. I mean, it's a peaceful movement against Lukashenko. The police aren't brutalizing people anymore. They can figure this out. I think Lukashenko is even to some extent being reasonable, and if things don't relent for a significant amount of time, he may be willing to give even more just from the threat that the United States might get involved. But I hope the Western countries in the European Union can keep the Americans out, because I think we all here understand that that would destabilize Europe and would be a serious blow to European integrity.
Thank you. That was the voice of Bradley Blankenship. Again, Bradley, I appreciate you joining us. For those listening, Bradley Blankenship is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter. His column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Again, Bradley Blankenship, thanks for being with us. Interesting conversation about Belarus. We'll be back in a minute with another 2 great hours of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And sitting on a log, the politically independent log, I am politically independent investigative political analyst Shane Stranahan.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, Joseph R. Biden Jr. is set to formally accept the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party tonight, end of the Democratic Party National Convention. Last night, Senator Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination, becoming the first black woman candidate to accept a major party's vice presidential nomination. Former President Barack Obama harshly attacked President Trump, warning that American democracy is on the line and telling him that Trump cannot live up to the office of the presidency. Trump struck back on Twitter and a few all-caps tweets posted live during the campaign saying about Obama, he spied on my campaign and got caught. He also made the point that Obama didn't select Joe Biden until the very end. Why? He was basically ripping, he was flipping out pretty heavily. Russia's main domestic political opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, is in serious condition in a Siberian hospital after he was allegedly poisoned. After boarding a plane, Navalny, Shane, am I pronouncing that right? Navalny? Okay, let's just, Navalny, thank you. Navalny began sweating and acting erratically before collapsing at the back of the plane. He reportedly required a respirator to breathe. According to this closest aide, Kira Yarmash, Navalny has been poisoned while or after drinking some black tea in a cafe at the Tomsk airport earlier Thursday morning. Iraq's new Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who came to power after his predecessor was forced to step down amid sweeping anti-government protests, is traveling to Washington today and expected to meet with President Trump to talk about troop counts, and the country's COVID response. Facebook is banning hundreds of more QAnon groups and will no longer recommend that users join groups supporting it, but has not yet imposed a ban on all members of the groups. Facebook removed 790 groups, 100 pages, and 1,500 ads tied to QAnon on Facebook and has blocked over 300 hashtags across Facebook and Instagram. There are 1,950 other groups and 440 pages that Facebook has tied to QAnon, which remain on the platform but face restrictions, along with 10,000 accounts on Instagram. Google said it removed tens of thousands of QAnon-related videos from YouTube service and banned hundreds of channels for violating its policies, but it does not ban QAnon outright. Right-wing political candidate and controversial media personality Laura Loomer has been banned from her social accounts after winning a primary. Banned from her social media accounts after winning a primary in a district that covers Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. Reportedly, those social media companies actually changed their rules to allow Laura Loomer to be banned after winning her primary. Loomer has been criticized for claiming that some victims of the mass shootings are crisis actors and being Sandy Hook hoaxers. According to a Senate report released Thursday, Jonathan Weiner, a prominent Christopher Steele connection in the Department of State, reportedly deleted all of his communications about Steele dossier in January 2017 at Steele's request. Steele had previously told a British court that he had wiped out all of his correspondence related to the dossier between December 2016 and January 2017. December 2016 and January 2017. He was also forced to walk back claims made in front of Congress back in 2017 that he had not invited Steele to be at the White House. After being shown the visitors' logs with Christopher Steele's name on them, Weiner said that he remembered arranging meetings between Steele and the State Department officials, but could not remember when. In South Korea, Seoul has banned protests of more than 10 people after cases reached a new high in the country. And there's one more that I want to give, and I want to talk about it with Shane immediately after. This has to do with the Iran snapback sanctions. Pompeo, this is The Guardian. Pompeo will travel to New York on Thursday to notify the UN Security Council that the United States is triggering the so-called quote-unquote snapback procedure, what Britain, France, Germany said it does not have the right to do. This is basically Europe pushing back on the United States, something that we don't often see. It's a snapback. It's not uncommon, Trump told reporters, despite the contested measures have never been used before. The move comes after the United States suffered a humiliating defeat at the Security Council last week when it failed to muster support for resolution that extend the conventional arms embargo on Iran. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So there are two things. Sometimes when I'm doing headlines, I may giggle at the end of a headline. And it's only because in my head I am thinking something, but I just want to get to the next headline in order to talk about it later. When I am reading the QAnon one, and Donald Trump had just had a press conference where they asked Donald Trump about QAnon, and he basically said, look, is fighting pedophiles and cannibals a bad thing? And the reporter's like, what? Because the reporter was basically asking him, look, there's a conspiracy theory group that has been going on for God knows how long that said you are secretly like a ninja in the night or superhero with a mask on, fighting pedophiles, globalists, and cannibals. Now, she, I imagine, expected Trump to push back saying, look, I don't buy this stuff. This stuff is... Trump basically fed into it. Because what Trump knows is that these guys are basically backing him. The interesting part in this is whether or not this is a plant, meaning this is something that is actually being pushed by elements of the administration with this kind of clandestine way of trying to get his supporters into certain belief sets. Look, I don't know one way or the other. I would say his supporters or QAnon supporters are being had. There is no reality to this. There was never a reality to this. This was always either some kind of CIA plot or somebody having fun at you. But at the end of the day, there's somebody that is taking the expense of somebody else. And, unfortunately, Donald Trump plays into this stuff, especially if it's somebody who will give him even one vote. And that's unfortunate. We have a caller. Steve, what's going on, man? I'm sorry. Thank you for holding.
He dropped.
Oh, okay.
Oh, he dropped.
Shane, okay.
Apparently.
Shane, let me ask you this. There's a few places we can go. We can go to the QAnon, we can go to Laura Loomer. I think I want to go to the Iran thing, though. So the United States pulls out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive, basically the nuclear agreement with Iran. And it took years to get this agreement. Iran had to give up a lot, especially from the standpoint of sovereignty, from the inspections and everything else, something that I have a hard time believing we would ever do. The restrictions were absurd. And what I mean by absurd is if you're trying to stop Iran from making a nuclear bomb and you're getting fissionable material and everything else, it takes a high degree of distillation in order to make that work. The argument was that they didn't even want them to get like 2%. And you're talking about like 90% purification of an emitter to make that work. Meaning it was so over the top as a political thing. And in many respects, the belief was that this prevented a war with Iran. And that's the way I think Obama framed it. And that's the way I think a lot of people around the time framed it. Trump gets in office. And because it's deal not necessarily done by the entirety of Congress, not a treaty, Trump can use an executive order to just get rid of it immediately because it was only done by an executive order. And as he gets rid of it, then he goes with this notion that despite the fact that Iran did nothing wrong in this, every other state recognizes that they have lived to the tenets of the agreement. Trump, liar, pulls out of it. Iran stays with it. And as Iran stays with it, their idea is, look, we're going to try to stay with this deal. We still have our European allies. Europe is acting insane about this stuff, but whatever. We still have our European allies. We're going to stay with the deal. And we don't want to give any pretext to allow any kind of a force or tax against us, especially since Europe and all of these other countries recognize we're staying with the deal. Then Trump ups the ante and say, I'm going to put on a pressure campaign. I'm going to add in sanctions. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to murder one of their leaders of their country. He's doing this stuff. I'm going to steal their tankers. Now, Iran's response to this has to be basically to play it cool because it doesn't necessarily want to get into a larger conflict. It understands that the U.S. doesn't want to get into a larger conflict and that this brinksmanship, even though it could end in something larger, it doesn't necessarily want to be the party responsible for it. Trump is now trying to get a snapback, and Europe doesn't buy it because there's no legitimacy to it. At the end of the day, it was the United States that shot the JCPOA in the face, not Iran. And whatever you want to think about Iran, they have lived up to the tenets of the deal. The United States has not. And honestly, Europe, if Europe has any credibility at all in this process, the people who you look at in this, it's not Iran. The party that you need to deal with and contain is the United States. What do you think about it, Shane? Do you think that there's any propensity at all for Europe to corral the United States in this? And by the way, even though Europe wanted to stand by Iran in this, they couldn't prevent or protect Iran from the sanctions. They couldn't protect Iran for any of that stuff that the United States wanted to do because their economy and its setup wasn't dominant enough or strong enough to prevent the U.S. from doing what it wanted to do. So many of those companies, even if they were based in Europe, was like, yeah, I have big dealings in the United States. I don't want to get my company sanctioned. So those companies would just stop doing deals. Like, it's astonishing the might of the U.S. and how weak and ineffective Europe was to basically try to hold up their end of this agreement.
I think so. The way that I see this stuff, Iran and Venezuela are important because they are not world powers; they are regional powers, which means that their decisions are sort of in some sense the testing ground for how the world order looks over the next couple of decades. In other words, as the United States and other countries respond to these sort of slightly more marginal countries, they're definitely. I mean, neither Iran nor Venezuela are marginal; they're large. Iran specifically, decent economy. Venezuela, obviously, with sanctions and everything, has been suffering. But regardless, my point is these are in the middle. These are not world powers. They're not dominating on a world scale like the U.S. Obviously, and now China and Russia. They're slightly more marginal, which means that they have a little bit more latitude. So Iran is sort of testing some of these, testing some things. They're sending the tankers. They're not just supporting Venezuela for economic or political reasons, I think, or at least the political reasons would encompass something slightly broader, which is they are, both for their own sakes and I'm sure for the sakes of their allies, gently pushing to see how the United States responds and to see how other, European countries respond. Because that is the window. That is the sort of, you don't have these conflicts. You have a lot of verbiage. You have a lot of words getting thrown back and forth between the world powers as they're dealing with their own affairs. And as United States sanctioning, it's sort of the United States in this weird insular way exercising some attempt to control, but it's not a direct intervention. It's not like, for instance, sending tankers. It's nothing quite so direct. And so I think this is, in some sense, I see it as a bellwether. It's a canary in the coal mine. If things start to go seriously wrong with Iran, these are the marginal conflicts that would both escalate into world conflicts potentially, from regional into world conflicts, but also can actually serve as the only real litmus test, I think, on a large scale for the state of the world geopolitically and for seeing how these things go. That's my broad take. With Iran specifically, there's more that I need to learn about that, and so I need to go back over the original nuclear deal. I wasn't paying as much attention, the JCPOA. I need to look at the different sides of that. I know that I don't know as much as I should, and so I don't want to voice too strong.
Well, let me say this.
It does seem to me, it does seem a little bit irresponsible for us to have walked it back so soon after having signed it. But then again, that's just party politics in the U.S. with this administration turnover, the churn that happens constantly. So anyway, yeah, go for it, Jamarl. Didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, we have 2 minutes, and we have callers, so we can get to the callers at the end of the break. So callers, hold on. But let me just say this: all of the signage, all of the people who signed that deal agreed that they were living up to the tenets of the deal. All of them, with the exception of the United States and Israel, also in Donald Trump's ear. Israel hated this deal. And if you remember, when Netanyahu came, he, comically ridiculous, holding up slides and talking about a bomb, the same thing he has been saying for the last 10, 20 years. And so, oh man, you would love this. Cory Booker. So Netanyahu comes and gives a speech in the well of Congress. This is a foreign leader in our Congress attacking our president. So any notion of allegiance and loyalty, even if it's your opposition, was out the window. Cory Booker sat there as Netanyahu bashed his own president. Isn't that amazing? Now the question is why? Cory Booker has a lot of money coming from Jewish groups. And one of these guys is a rabid Zionist. And Cory Booker, even though he can't get Cory Booker to do everything, he can get Cory Booker to demean himself and sit there as Netanyahu bashes his own president. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. That one is always comical me, that's all. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be taking calls when we come back. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory, or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're
Welcome
back.
back
You're
to Fault
listening
Lines.
to Fault Lines.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, man. We just
No,
bumped
I'm sorry.
into
We
each
just
other
clashed.
in the hallway. Exactly.
Yeah.
We're taking calls, 202-521-1320. Tarif. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on, Tarif?
Good morning, gentlemen. How y'all doing? Okay, I got 4 comments. Dealing with the Earth's weakening of the southern hemisphere and the Earth's magnetic field. Where NASA had put out a link. I put a link to your tweet for today. You have 2 growing anomalies in the southern hemisphere that's weakening. Then you have the sun set off a solar flare, a solar storm that's hitting Earth right now. And right then and there, that should tell you what a cancer society putting everything on microchips and things like that can be affected by a CME or EMP. So that's not good. So you got to consider that. Millie Weaver contract was terminated by Alice Jones. She must be over the target dealing with a documentary, Settlegate, because Jones Group and Cliff Force pulled a boards of directors page, people names that was on there. So, and she's been banned across social media because they say documentary is hate speech, but when you watch it, it's not hate speech. It's about what's going on with these government contractors. My last comment dealing with Trump, he did a good thing by courting that woman from 100 years ago. I forgot her name. I can't believe
Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah, he did a good thing by courting her because I think when it comes down to they need a neutral host for the debate, something like the League of Women. Well, we already know they're going to be hard on Trump, but they need to be hard on Biden. So when they're going at it with each other, that would be good. And one last comment, the NIH is also saying no evidence that on blood plasma is working to fight against, I don't remember his name, but it's plasma from the blood. It's not working well against coronavirus, but it is working well. So that's 3 things now. Hydroxychloroquine, the Russian vaccine, and now blood plasma. That's
but Sharif,
going on.
All of these places, Sharif, two questions. All of these places, whether it's the CBC, the World Health Organization, these places are basically saying, look, based on our studies, based on our research, based on an aggregation of the data, we don't think these things work. It doesn't seem like they work. Now, I am not a doctor. There may be things that I may engage with from a medical point, from my own experience, where I may say, yes, I know this because I've engaged it. If we're talking about kidney disease on any level, yes, I would argue with my doctor vociferously because I've experienced it for X number of years, and I understand in a way that he doesn't. If it's something where we are discussing from the standpoint of like research material, fair enough, same thing. But at this point, all of these groups are basically saying this drug is ineffective. Why do you love this drug so much? And if what is it about hydroxychloroquine that you just love, that you need to kind of coddle it in this way?
I don't think that's what it is. I think that it became notorious because of the back and forth over Trump backing it and the politicization
I know,
of
but it
that resulted.
continues to come up. But it continues to come up, even when these other companies, even when these organizations that are supposed to be dealing with the virus said this doesn't work.
Yeah, well,
People
that's
still
because
are
it's
like,
top of mind. It's one of those. It's one.
I know,
It's one of
Shane.
this. It's one of the potential solutions. I mean, but there are a couple.
But it's
other
not a
points
potential
here.
solution. That's my point. If you have all of these scientists saying it's not a potential solution, and you're like, I disagree with that. What are you using? This is the climate change argument again. It's like you have
because here's the
Republicans saying,
idea.
I don't believe in climate change. And it's like, why not? God said it's not going to happen.
You've talked about it yourself. You've talked about it how certain officials in government are both suspected of and are known to have investments in companies
Yes.
that would benefit. It would benefit from the selective application of medicine and this kind of thing. I mean, why wouldn't the same? Again, I don't know this stuff, and I'm not trying to actually make claims. I have heard claims, but I'm not trying to make strong claims. Whether it's the financial benefit of a powerful corporation or set of corporations who have investments in different pharmaceuticals, and those are competing with other options, or whether it's the international, and we talked about this too, the international sort of modern space race, this prestige race, where by selectively suppressing certain medications that are either accessible to everyone or were invented by other nations, there's an incentive to do that. And so I see that stuff. I see both of those, and I don't push back too seriously, because like you're saying, most medical authorities are saying that hydroxychloroquine shouldn't be a first line of defense, that it isn't effective for various reasons, whatever. There's some nuance there that I don't hear, like the fact that hydroxychloroquine supposedly is more effective earlier during the viral replication phase and less effective later during the inflammatory phase. That would make sense because it is like this anti-malarial, it's an antiviral, so it would be more effective during that phase. I don't know how well that stuff gets taken into account. I can tell you from my perspective, I've seen how some of these studies have gone. I mean, whether it's going back to the Lancet one that relied on a false database with false data with skewed data that just was very soon disproven. And again, that was directly about hydroxychloroquine. There was a series of events that have just led to the loss of credibility on the part of the scientific establishment. I mean, one quick thing here, we've got other calls, and I don't mean to take too long in the response because we were having a back and forth, but even the problem of the replication crisis, for instance, there are these looming problems in science that are not the fault of the public's, and the public gets blamed for distrusting science when science itself has become untrustworthy in many cases. And I'm not saying in every case. I am a person who believes that scientific knowledge stands above all other forms of knowledge as the sort of purest and most universal form of knowledge. But that doesn't mean that the scientific establishment at any given point is right about all the facts, or that they haven't been co-opted by some corruption or some special interest groups. That kind of thing happens too, Jamarl. That's my take.
I don't have this belief that any institution is flawless. I never make that case. I think all of these people are human beings with biases and everything else. I do think scientists try to the degree that they can, I mean, there's still people, try to eliminate that through the scientific method and through replication of results and those type of things. And, so I've never made the argument that science is flawless or science is God or anything. Science is a tool, and it's just there for investigative or trying to understand the universe. Look, from the standpoint of the COVID thing, I don't think scientists have lost credibility. Look, they're people, they make mistakes, and they're going to get things wrong. There are going to be some studies that are wrong, which is why you have multiple studies, and there's the replication of results. All of these things are factors of science, falsifiability, or the idea that anything can be falsified if there's additional information that comes out that falsifies the thing. It's just a tool in trying to understand our world. That tool was put up against COVID-19 while everybody was watching and while the entire world was engaged. And just like any other research, there'll be mistakes, there'll be things that get wrong, there'll be studies that get wrong, there'll be experiments that are not necessarily airtight, that people find flawed. All of those things are going to happen. That's not a degradation of science. That's not a lack of credibility. If anything, you can say that that's a process or a thing affirming itself through its ability to kind of investigate itself. I don't find that to be a negative. I do think it's a negative if the public, not understanding how this stuff works, or not having a good grasp on how multiple experiments, multiple things of trying to validate a particular idea of the world and all of those things. Some of those things, just by definition, can come out to be wrong. People make mistakes. So I don't have this idea that these guys are gods by no stretch. If you hear me arguing metaphysics stuff, I will be going after science. You even hear me make the argument that give me one magic or one miracle and I'll explain the rest. It's a dig at physics for this idea that they have this understanding of the universe when they make this Big Bang Theory, which is, just magic. Let's go to callers. I just want to make that clear. I don't have this godlike belief in science by any stretch of the imagination. You should see the books back here. These things are metaphysics. Rod in Philly. What's going on, Rod?
Hey, good morning, gentlemen. Just wanted to, yesterday the phone lines were cut off, so wasn't able to call in. But Shane, you brought up the Australia or Melbourne in Australia is they're initiating mandatory vaccines, which, like you said, is scary. It's very scary for a government to tell you have to take this syringe or number syringe, because we already know the COVID-19, you have to take multiple doses. And I just wanted to talk about, just when Tariq called in and how the conversation started going, the CDC, which Robert Redfield holds up, is the head of whistleblower named William Thompson. Anybody can look it up, William Thompson, CDC whistleblower. William Thompson blew the whistle that the MMR vaccine was a lead cause directly to autism in children, especially young Black boys. This is a statistical fact based on the research. So this is when we talk about research. Another fact that people miss, because it's very polarizing. Jeffrey Epstein had scientists on his plane, on his trips, in his house, doing what? Getting blackmailed, because they would have relations with young girls or other boys or whoever, and they would get co-opted, and then they would be in the government. So we kind of miss those two things. We have a CDC whistleblower. We have Jeffrey Epstein having 20, I believe it was over 20 scientists that he would have over his in his island. And we have another thing. We had the My Pillow guy on TV the other day. I know it's gone viral, where Anderson Cooper's yelling at him that he's not a scientist, that he has no science background. But then Bill Gates goes on every major network, and nobody's ever asked him, why are you talking about vaccinating Africa, vaccinating the whole world, vaccinating America, especially children, older people, and you have zero? I mean, Homer Simpson has a more science background than Bill Gates, but he's able to do that. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you for the call, Rod. We've got two other calls. There's a bunch of stuff to respond to,
Yeah.
but we've got to go
just
straight
20
to
seconds.
calls.
I agree with you, Rod, and I agree with Shane. I think both of those things are problematic to have forced vaccinations.
Yeah, I don't like that stuff either. I think there's some more stuff with Bill Gates, but again, we don't have time. We should come back on it. We got Eric calling in from Vermont. Eric, what's going on?
How are you doing, guys? Listen, I just want to question about, we're talking about Blackfeet chloroquine, I think, for health property. But why don't you have people like Ben Swan and Del Bigtree on your show?
He's coming on today. Bill Swan coming on today.
That's actually very funny. We're gonna have to go straight to the next call. I'm sorry, but to answer your question very quickly, we literally have Ben Swan coming on this morning at 9:30 in about an hour exactly to talk about hydroxychloroquine. So there you go.
Take that, buddy.
Right. No. Thank you for the call, Eric. Malik from DC. Malik, you're on the line. What's going on? We've got about a minute, so let's just keep this quick.
I got you. It's Malik again. But
listen, I'm so sorry, man. I tried to remember. I'm sorry.
No, it's cool. Sorry. It's cool. Jamal, when you were hosting the other show, I guess is that Political Misfits, correct?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. You guys had a doctor come on and who basically laid out the entire history of the development of this current coronavirus, and showed that there were many participants in the development of this current coronavirus, and which gave enough evidence that we should all be a bit skeptical at the origin of this thing and some of the aims around what is going on globally. But I did want to push back on this belief in the support of the technocracy and the rise of the deification of science. I come
Oh,
from a
dude,
community.
wait, hold on, wait, Malik. Malik, I'm sorry.
Malik.
Call back at 9 o'clock. Malik, right?
Yeah,
Call back. I have a
that'll
friend of
be an
mine with the
interesting
same spelling. His name's Malik. This is going to be a longer conversation. So call back at either 9 o'clock or 9:15, where we can actually get further into this. Is that fair?
Absolutely, I'll do my best.
Okay. Thank you very much. Because I want to have this talk. But you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with Walter Smolarek. We're going to be talking about Democrats questioning Pompeo on China. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. If you guys are digging this content, you can reach us, at least in the next segment, either by tweet or, for that matter, by phone, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. If you're listening to us on radio and you're in the Washington, D.C. area, that number or that call sign is 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. You can also reach us in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. But right now, we are joined by Walter Smolarek, Sputnik News analyst and producer of Loud and Clear, airing Monday through Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Walter, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us. Walter, can you hear us? Okay, Walter may be having a few difficulties. Oh, there you are. Walter, can you hear us?
Hey, good to be on the show. Yep.
Oh, man, thank you for joining us. So, there is a weird news story that's coming up, and I thought you might be one of the great people to talk to on the subject. Basically, early on, I think this was a few months ago, there was talk about Saudi Arabia getting technology from the United States on nuclear technology. And basically, Trump had asked that the companies that were involved in this basically not disclose this. And people were concerned. It's like you're giving this totalitarian regime that just deboned a guy and tried to debone somebody else nuclear weapons. This doesn't necessarily seem safe. Later on, though, the story recently migrated to this notion that China was helping Saudi Arabia apparently get nuclear weapons. Can you give us some explanation on what is going on with this? Apparently, Democrats have been pushing Pompeo for more information after the administration basically threw this out there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm highly skeptical of it. From a geopolitical point of view, I don't think China has any interest whatsoever in Saudi Arabia developing nuclear weapons. China's main principle, I guess you could say, when it comes to dealing with countries in the Middle East is, to have mutually beneficial economic arrangements. They're willing to do business with pretty much anybody. And that's generally true across the board, although maybe it's by necessity becoming a little bit more selective as U.S.-China confrontation develops. But yeah, I mean, doing something as dramatic to change the balance of
But
power.
wait a minute, wouldn't that confrontation make them less likely to allow Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons? I mean, when I heard the story, I thought to myself, what would be the advantage in this? It just seems like you have an ally of the United States. And the thought that you would give an ally of the United States nuclear weapons as they're at your throat seems really bizarre to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially when, one of China's major trading partners in the Middle East, I believe their largest one is Iran, right? The sort of sworn enemy of Saudi Arabia. And I mean, pretty much everything that Saudi Arabia does regionally is meant to, box in Iran, amp up pressure on Iran, make it more likely that really the U.S.-led regime change effort against that country will succeed. And so something as dramatic as helping Saudi Arabia develop nuclear weapons, I mean, this seems like just such a far-fetched story to me.
It seems like a far-fetched story to me also. From China's point of view, I mean, what has China responded to this in any way, meaning affirming or denying? And just to give the specifics, this is The Guardian. U.S. officials have told journalists that nuclear experts, they suspect a mill for producing yellow cake uranium. Now, if you remember yellow cake uranium, this was this farcical stuff that was supposedly pulled out of Africa that Saddam Hussein had a relationship with that the United States apparently was making their case for. So we're back to yellow cake uranium. It's being built by Chinese technicians in a desert near Al-Ula in northwest of the kingdom. Now, one of the, I would say, scams that is often made in world politics is by pointing to the other guy and say, I got to do it because of that guy. Now, their argument is, look, we have to do this because Iran may be producing nuclear weapons, which the participants of the JCPOA is basically saying it's not happening. Do you think Saudi Arabia is pursuing nuclear weapons, whether or not China is doing or anything to help, or for that matter, whether or not the U.S. is even kind of helping in clandestine ways? Is this something that these guys are actually trying to appropriate? And is there any news or information that's saying that they are or that they're not?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's a different question. I mean, aside from whether or not China is involved in that, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely the government of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi regime, does desire a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power. Right now, the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East is Israel. And, of course, Israel doesn't officially acknowledge that. They don't admit it, but everyone knows that they have it. Saudi Arabia is, the Saudi leadership, the Saudi monarchy views themselves as kind of the natural leader of the Arab world, of the Muslim world, by virtue of being, the custodians of Mecca. And, I think it sort of fits with their goal of being kind of like the anchor, the principal junior partner, the subcontractor of the U.S. empire in the Middle East, for them to also be a nuclear-armed state. And of course, that's something that would make it much, much easier for them to place pressure on Iran or to actually wage a war against Iran, right? Because Saudi Arabia, for all its vast wealth, has very little fighting capacity itself. I mean, the Saudi armed forces would be completely wiped out in the event of a war with Iran. And a nuclear weapon is something that would sort of fundamentally change that calculation.
Wow. I'm curious, how does the populations in those countries see this? I mean, recently we've had the UAE deal with Israel. Saudi Arabia has had, let's say, diplomatic ties with Israel, especially going through the United States. Even though Saudi Arabia sees itself as the leader of, let's say, the Middle East in this regard, so does Iran. I mean, and you can even make an argument, like you just said, that Iran has a clearer mandate for that or a clearer tie to that. Despite Saudi Arabia for the moment, UAE actually has diplomatic ties with Iran. And if Israel also now has diplomatic ties with UAE, what does that mean for the relationships of those countries in that region? And has this deal altered anything within the context of those relationships? I understand that the Palestinians were basically screwed over in this deal, but from the standpoint of the world powers or regional powers, how has that deal with the UAE changed, if it has changed anything in that region?
Yeah, I think it's highly consequential. There's been sort of this contradiction in the geopolitics of the Middle East, where there's a clear common interest between Israel and the Gulf monarchies, essentially the most powerful being Saudi Arabia, but that also includes the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, basically the countries that view Iran as their number one enemy. They have a clear mutual interest, a long-term interest in pursuing policies and alliances that isolate Iran and could, in the most adverse scenario, become a formidable military alliance against Iran and Iran's allies. But it's very difficult for that Israel Gulf monarchy alliance to materialize out in the open because public opposition for Israel, the apartheid policies that they enact in the towards Palestinians, it's so wildly unpopular and for very good reason among the population of the Gulf monarchies and the entire Middle East and other parts of the world too. But it's just considered to be this ultimate political taboo because of course the populations of those countries know very well how ever since Israel's creation it's waged war constantly on its neighbors, including Saudi Arabia's gone to war with Israel in the past too. But the maneuver pulled by the United Arab Emirates by posturing as like, oh well, we're doing this to prevent the annexation of Palestinian lands by Israel. They've kind of neutralized to some extent that argument, or to the necessary extent that argument, and has gotten away with doing what I think they would have liked to have done a long time ago, normalize relations with Israel in order to strengthen the anti-Iranian axis in the region.
That's interesting. See, I was thinking of it through a business lens, that regardless of what the population might have wanted, that the monarchs are looking for, like you said, to naturalize relations with Israel, but doing so, in my head, for enrichment. Like kind of like our politics in the United States, that regardless of what your population wants, you have 88% people who want Medicare for all in the Democratic Party. They still say, yeah, we'll add on a factor to Obamacare. Meaning there's a difference between what people in power want and what they say they want, as opposed to what the population wants. So when the deal with the UAE was struck, my thought was, okay, you have some people who may profit magnificently off of it, but can't necessarily own up to them taking this deal. It's just like anywhere else where you have people who are in power who want to do things that people who are not in power don't want them to do, and they come up with some kind of justification to do it. And in their specific case, we're stopping annexation, or we're trying to prevent annexation. When really, the entire point was, just like Saudi Arabia, we wanted to have these relations with Israel anyway, regardless of what the population itself wanted. Do you think that's more right than not? I mean, as opposed to the annexation thing. The annexation thing just sounds like a fig leaf to do what they wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, I agree. The annexation thing is definitely a fig leaf. I mean, whether it's called like an annexed part of, what Israel claims as its national territory, or if it's part of, Area C of the West Bank, it doesn't change the actual reality on the ground, which is that these areas are controlled by the Israeli military, right? They're under Israeli military occupation, and the Palestinian people who live there are denied self-determination. Annexation is a legal status. People were, I think, right to be upset that Israel was considering taking that legal step of formally saying, okay, this is, we claim this as part of our national territory. But it doesn't actually change anything, right, about who's in charge there. So, Israel really gives up nothing. The Netanyahu government gives up nothing other than, it makes the extreme settler right wing within Israeli domestic politics upset. But then again, I mean, who else are they going to support? Not any other bloc, certainly. So, it's a huge win for the Netanyahu government. I could see economics being, part of the motivation. Israel is a developed economy, and the ability to have economic relations between businessmen in the UAE and businessmen in Israel, certainly people are going to get pretty rich off of that. I do think that the geopolitical angle is primary, though. I mean, for instance, like right after the normalization agreement was signed, the head of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, visited the UAE and met with national security officials, and it's obvious, I think, to everybody that what they were talking about was confrontation with Iran. The UAE has not had a great streak, in the region. They're heavily
Walter,
engaged
let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to bring you back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment. You guys have been listening to Walter Smolarek, Sputnik News analyst and producer for the Loud and Clear, airing Monday through Friday from 4 to 6 Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Sorry, having some technical problems there in the last segment too. So for that reason, the first part of the segment conversation, we moved on to the UAE, Israel, China potentially arming. Anyway, I want to actually come back to China. Sorry about that. Glad to have you, Walter. By the way, it's been a while since we've talked. Thank you for joining us. I want to move back to China for a second. What do you think? And I'm not 100% sure that you guys talked about this. I don't think you've talked about this aspect of it. How would it affect the Chinese economy for the U.S. to sort of go full stop with an economic retrenchment, with pushing away from China, effectively sanctioning either a variety of companies with banks? It seems like there's this sort of scale of aggression economically, or a ladder that the United States could accelerate along to bring us to something. And it seems like we're starting to walk up the rungs of that ladder with more aggression. So I'm trying to get to what the core of the conflict will probably be in the next coming years, which is primarily economic in nature. Walter, I've heard you speak very fluently on these issues. Where do you think that will take us? What do you think that's going to look like in the next few years, both from the Chinese perspective and from the American perspective?
Well, this is one of the fundamental issues of global politics, really, this issue of the decoupling of the Chinese and U.S. economies, or the Chinese economy from the Western economy. The Chinese government, I think, has been preparing for this for quite some time. Their main break, I think, in terms of the conflict between the United States and China escalating into what could even be a shooting war, is the fact that the economies of those two countries are so tightly bound together. So many U.S. companies manufacture a wide variety of parts and components in China that are vital for global supply chains. The idea that there would be all-out conflict between China and the United States, or China and the West more broadly, was basically made unthinkable by the fact that the economies of both countries can't really function properly without each other. But a lot of long-term policies are being pursued now, and I think with a lot more vigor, to actually make that possible, right? So decoupling meaning that the Chinese economy could function, maybe not well, but it could function with hardly any interaction with the United States, and vice versa too. So the fact that many U.S. companies, because they viewed the tariffs and other trade war related measures as long-term and not just particular to the Trump administration, are looking to other countries to move their factories to Vietnam, to India, to Taiwan, That's happening, and it's gaining pace. And similarly, China is looking to develop alternative export markets to take the place of the United States. So that's what the whole Belt and Road Initiative is about. It's about creating this alternate trading system where Chinese goods can access different markets. That's why there's such a heavy emphasis within the Chinese government and among Chinese corporations and financial institutions about financing infrastructure projects in other countries, so that those countries can over time take the place of the U.S. As an export market for Chinese manufactured goods. So this is something that I think is going to take a long time, but there are kind of milestones that we can identify. For instance, for the very first time, the majority of trade between China and Russia took place, not using U.S. dollars, right? They would either use the national currencies of either China or Russia, or they did trade using the euro. But for the first time this year, the majority of trade was not done in U.S. dollars between China and Russia. That's a sign of the decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies.
Walter, I also think it's an interesting component that we talk about what happens to the United States with this. Like, this is not a one-sided equation. The sanctions and bringing jobs back home and everything else that Trump is talking about, that has a cost. So it's like you go to Walmart and that $4 thing that you bought is now $20. Or you bring the jobs back home, and a job where they were paying people $2 in China, you're now paying something 16 or 17 in the United States. And even though the wages are higher, you have a situation where that translates in the cost of the item, which people complain about. Like, it's not a one-sided equation. It really does hurt both sides. Soybeans, perfect example. Trump passes a trade war. China, tit for tat, not willing to accept it. And they're very specific in what they go after. And what they go after are basically areas that Trump won in the election. They were trying to make it difficult for those people, so they realized your president is screwing you over by the deals and the policies that he is putting forth. I think something like that will probably happen on a larger scale if the United States got into this point of actually going further into this trade war process, or, for matter, either these sanctions. How could China respond to this? I'm curious about this, because I don't think that the Chinese government, with the size of the economy they have, is going to just sit back and accept whatever the U.S. does. At very least, based on the behavior prior, you kick my dog, I slap your cat. That seems to be the thing. So what's the slap of the cat in this analogy? How does China respond if Trump does go further? Like, the WeChat or the Huawei, these attacks. How does China respond to this in a way that tries to put a certain degree of pain on the U.S. to stop it from behaving in the way that it's behaving?
Well, China, I think China is actually in a pretty difficult position there, because at the same time as it must respond, right, to retain credibility as a significant global power, it has to respond, at least in part, in kind to any economic measures taken by the United States against it, right? So even though the amount of goods being sent to the United States from China is greater than the amount of goods being sent from the United States, the other way around, meaning that China can't do go dollar for dollar with tariffs, right? Because there's just less stuff for the Chinese government to slap tariffs on. They will, I think, continue to impose retaliatory tariffs to one degree or another, whenever the United States takes a similar measure. But at the same time, I think the Chinese government is really relying on the business lobby in the United States to place political pressure on the U.S. government to essentially rein this in, right? So there's big companies, Apple, for instance, that really heavily dependent on Chinese manufacturing for their global supply chains. And of course, those are very politically powerful institutions, these big corporations in the United States. And so I think China doesn't want to alienate big sections of the business lobby in the United States so that they can retain that sort of that it's not support, but kind of allies of convenience.
So another side of this, even preceding the virus, even before the virus took its toll on the global markets, and it even specifically even before the virus began anew these conversations about trying to sort of separate out the world's economies, either different countries. It started, I'll say, in the U.S. with the reservoirs of masks, with our mask stockpiling, where the supply chain for the masks at the floor basically dropped out. We lost the ability to buy them in, and of course that led to widespread months of delays, basically. And that was a huge, very early key part of our medical crisis. Now, part of the problem with that is obviously on our government. The blame can be laid at their feet for not preparing. But another part of this, and this conversation started up around the same time a few months ago, is with the globalization of world markets, with supply chains distributed so widely, it might make more sense to look for a little bit more local production, especially with some of these critical industries. And so that sort of dovetails into this trade war with China, which, again, it's not just about trying to suppress Chinese growth. It's not just about militarily our conflict with them. It can also be seen in some sense as a response to this longer term process where the United States is the administrator of the world economy, not just the world political apparatus, but also the economy internationally. We're now apparently through Trump pulling back from that and moving to something like a more national economy with locally produced goods and a focus on local production. And this, you mentioned the Chinese dollar. This would fit in with that. If the U.S. dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, that's certainly going to change its ability, its incentives to produce and export goods. So that's all at play there. But here's where I'm bringing it back. It dovetails the conversation about whether to move production back to the U.S. or how to negotiate that process. Do you see, Walter? Do you see that potentially playing as cover for this trade war? In other words, I'll put it like this. Even though what complicates things is that China was the nation widely suspected of being the origin of the virus, the United States has dealt with the virus worse than any other country on the face of the earth. China dealt with it first and pretty effectively. So there's this very weird sort of initial confusion there. But here's where I'm getting specifically with the trade question. Do you see the potential that we instead of having this drawn out trade dispute with China, the U.S. might be able to sort of cover itself, cover its tail, cover its losses, whatever it's gained, and step back, and instead of making it about China, instead we might make it about the pandemic, and we might move towards local production. In other words, not on this military ground. Do you see the potential for that, or is that idealistic, or what's your take on that issue, that potential, Walter?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's definitely possible. I mean, we could maybe think of it as an accelerant for the process, that it's sort of one more argument in the column of bringing production back to the United States, or at least decoupling economically with China. Yeah, I mean, what I consider to be a pretty ridiculous blame game played by the Trump administration, trying to say that the virus was unleashed on the world by China. Or, the implication is intentionally, or maybe not intentionally, but they just mismanaged it and screwed it up so bad. That has the effect of undoing any progress or damage control done by the this sort of phase one trade deal between the United States and China, negotiated by the Trump administration, signed by the Trump administration. That happened not too long, but just a couple months before the pandemic began, and
1 minute
because the world economy was plunged into its most profound crisis since the Great Depression. That kind of rendered the terms of the trade agreement null and void, effectively. I mean, even though both sides are still nominally committed to it. Because, China is part of the trade deal. This is the core of the trade deal. China pledged to buy more stuff from the United States. But, the United States' ability to sell that and China's capacity to purchase it in the middle of this horrific economic crisis is greatly diminished. So there's that as well.
Well, Walter, we're about to end. So, Walter, where can people find your work if they wanted to check you out and check out what you were doing? I know you're a spending news analyst here, but I'm going to let you give your area of expertise, or where you can be found.
Oh, well, we'll listen to Loud and Clear every day from 4 to 6 p.m. on Sputnik Radio. We're on vacation this week, but we're going to be back on Monday. So yeah, check it out, loud and clear, 4 to 6 p.m. in the Washington, D.C. area.
10 seconds.
105.5 FM.
Very cool. You guys have listening to Walter Smolarek, Sputnik News analyst and producer for Loud and Clear, airing Monday through Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back live, coming to you from the divided states of America. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host Shane Stranahan, your political analyst Jamarl Thomas.
And again, together on that wall, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There we go. All right, we're through it. We're talking headlines now. We do these every morning at 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern. And I'll just get right into it. Joe Biden Jr. is set to formally accept the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party at tonight's end of the Democratic National Convention. That's right. Tonight is the last night of the DNC's convention. By the way, the RNC will be happening next week. So look forward to that. I suppose should be a lot simpler in its own way than this one. Everything is already settled, although, of course, everything has been settled for the DNC for a little while now. Last night, Senator Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination, becoming the first black woman candidate to accept a major party's vice presidential nomination. Former President Barack Obama harshly attacked President Trump. I've heard this called the harshest attack by a former president on a sitting president, by one president on somebody who succeeded him at that. Obama warned America that democracy is on the line, and told the public that Trump cannot live up to the office of the presidency. So he was making sort of deep character attacks, looking at how the administration's handled COVID, various crises. Trump struck back quickly on Twitter. In a few all-caps tweets he posted live during the event, Trump said about Obama that Obama had spied on my campaign. I'm going to just quote this in all caps. You can imagine it. He spied on my campaign and got caught, quote, end quote. As succinct as ever. Again, though, tonight is the last night of the Democratic National Convention. Watch that and weep, I suppose. In our next headline, Russia's main domestic political opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, is in serious condition at a Siberian hospital after he was allegedly poisoned. After boarding a plane, Navalny began sweating and acting erratically before collapsing at the back of that plane. His closest aides said he may have been poisoned while or after drinking some black tea in a cafe at to breathe. In our third headline, Iraq's new Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who came to power after his predecessor was forced to step down amid sweeping anti-government protests, is traveling to Washington today. He's expected to meet with President Trump while there. They're going to be talking about troop counts reportedly and the country's COVID response, Iraq's COVID response. Facebook, meanwhile, is banning hundreds more QAnon groups. This is a sort of widespread thing. They're no longer going to recommend that users join groups supporting the QAnon movement. They have not yet imposed a ban on all members of the group, however. Facebook removed 790 groups, 100 pages, and 1,500 ads tied to QAnon on Facebook. And it has blocked over 300 hashtags across Facebook and Instagram. There are 1,950 other groups active on Facebook and about 440 other pages that Facebook has tied to QAnon. Those remain on the platform again, but they do face restrictions. There are also about 10,000 accounts on Instagram with a similar status. Google said it removed, this is again, moving to Google, from Facebook to Google. Google said it removed tens of thousands of QAnon-related videos from its YouTube service and banned hundreds of channels for violating its policies, but has also said that it does not ban QAnon outright. In a somewhat related story, in a sort of a similar flavor, right-wing political candidate and controversial media personality Laura Loomer has been banned from her social media accounts. This comes after winning a primary in a district that covers Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. Reportedly, those social media companies also actually changed their rules to allow Loomer to be banned after winning her primary. So they basically, again, changed their rules so that after she won the primary, because they have to step around political candidates. That has become one of their sort of boundaries that they're not willing to cross, apparently. But it seems like they've at least temporarily resettled that boundary. They've moved that wall. Anyway, Loomer has been criticized for claiming that some victims of mass shootings are quote unquote crisis actors, and for being a Sandy Hook hoaxer. In our next headline, according to a Senate report released Tuesday, Jonathan Weiner, a prominent Christopher Steele connection in the Department of State, and the subject, by the way, if you go back to our interview with Lucy Commissar at 9:30 Eastern, we were talking about Jonathan Weiner, lawyer for APCO, attorney for APCO. Walt Kordakovsky was one of their main clients. We were talking about Browder, the Magnitsky stuff. Anyway, interesting segment yesterday. Back to today's headline. According to a Senate report released Tuesday, Jonathan Weiner reportedly deleted all of his communications about the Steele dossier in January of 2017 at Steele's request. This comes at around the same time Steele reportedly deleted all of his correspondence relating to that dossier. He told the British court that between December of 2016 and January of 2017, that was the period he wiped his out. And apparently, again, he was speaking with some of his associates, at the very least, Jonathan Weiner in this case, encouraging them to do so as well. Weiner was also forced to walk back claims he made in front of Congress back in 2017 that he had not invited Steele to the White House. He'd said that he had not invited Steele to the White House. However, after being shown visitor logs with Christopher Steele's name on them, again, at his invitation, Weiner said that he remembered arranging meetings between Steele and State Department officials, but could not remember when. And it's something like my last headline. I might throw the other one in real quick. In South Korea, Seoul has banned meetings. The capital, Seoul, has banned meetings and protests of more than 10 people after cases reached a new high in the country. Cases there center around church, over 100 branches, many hundreds of cases sparked from that church in recent weeks. Also, Germany hitting its peak again. And you know what? I'll throw this one. This is kind of a weird one. I want to look into it more. This is definitely a last and least headline. But in Tokyo, a museum on ninjas was broken into and had a safe stolen containing about $10,000. I'm just gonna say that is definitely a last but least headline. I just like the idea that a museum on ninjas was broken into and a safe containing not that much money was stolen. It seems like an act of art. It seems like an act of like human performance. It could just be burglary though. I really don't know. But again, a museum about ninjas was broken into. Anyway, those are the headlines. That's the top news. Apparently, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There we go. All right. Again, not important, not world historic. I just thought that was a little bit funny. And apparently it did happen. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. 202-521-1320. Malik, we've got Malik calling in from D.C. Malik, you're on. What's going on?
How you doing there, guys? Calling back from earlier. I just wanted to touch on, I guess the theme of some of your conversations, especially the idea around science. And I have to tell you, it's extremely disturbing to a sector, maybe a very small minority of the population. This whole deification, or should I say, science is the new theology, even amongst the population that don't really understand the technology that's in their pocket. I think it's really disturbing, and I think we're also watching one of the greatest, whether or not you agree with how this quote unquote pandemic is being handled, whether or not you agree that hydroxychloroquine, which has been used for lupus and malaria for God knows how long, but all of a sudden it doesn't have any efficacy anymore, is really disturbing. And also the immense social engineering that is taking place globally, and the fact that you cannot speak about these things. It's really disturbing. I come from a a community of not just politically conscious people, but of spiritually conscious people. I come from an alternative healing community. And, you know, in the past 20 years, whether folks want to call it the New Age movement or so on, there's been a push in humanity to actually evolve the human being. And science and doesn't is not afraid of science, but sees science as a tool and sees the human being as the actual highest form of technology on the planet. And I'm very disturbed by, and I'll be very honest, folks of of their late 20s and early 30s that are really accepting social engineering. And it's very disturbing. I feel like we're at a pivotal time in human development, and we're about to step back. And this whole thing of this RNA designed vaccine that's about to be pushed on us that will actually rewrite our DNA. And the fact that
now, Malik, don't go anywhere. Stay on the line. Stay on the line. Wait, Malik.
I'll stop there.
Wait. I want you to stay on the line, though.
Okay.
Look, I don't have a deification of science. I don't think I have a deification of anything. It depends on what we're talking about. If we are talking about a drug, no one said that hydroxychloroquine doesn't have any efficacy. It's just that it doesn't have any efficacy for this. And even that, when I hear it, my thought is it could be true or it could be false. You must understand, in my head, nothing or most things aren't absolutes. Most things are some approaching 0 to 1, meaning it could either it's more true or it's less true. And this is no different. If they come up tomorrow and they say hydroxychloroquine actually does stave off death in the early signs of the thing, I have no issue with that. If they come out tomorrow and say the opposite, I have no issue with that. I have no feelings one way or the other because I don't know. I take it as, okay, what is the prevalence or what's the most likely to be true?
I think
this notion of science.
Malik's,
Hold on.
Malik's
The motion of science, though. The motion of science is deification. As a human being, I agree with you. There's nothing that you said right now that I disagree with you on. I don't think science is indistinct from New Age or from humanism. When I make these, if you've ever heard me on my show get into stuff like out-of-body experiences or lucid dream states or remote viewing, now scientists may have issue with that, but I would argue that, well, yeah, but those things can either be proven, disproven, or at the very least validated through science. It's not so much that, look, science sometimes takes a worldview that it knows all of these things, and oftentimes it doesn't, and it shields itself from those things. So I agree with you. I also agree with you that human beings, we don't know a huge amount of why we're here, how this is even set up. And those things require a certain amount of investigation that I also agree with you. That scientists don't necessarily go that way, and you leave other people through other methods of either alternative healing or, for that matter, alternative knowledge, maybe through like dream states or lucid states or even obese states. I agree with you on all that stuff. I don't think people have started looking at science as a new religion. Agreed. There are new priests. There are new high priests. But I don't think we do that. And I think that's why I take issue with that. Just because we're talking about something, we're saying, look, a high form of us trying to understand our world, whether you're in these humanism pursuits, whether you're in these new age pursuits, is still science. It's just a tool for investigation. And I understand some people take it as if it's, I believe in science. It's like, I believe in a hammer. Look, I agree with you, everything you said, Malik. I'm pretty sure that there's disagreement in there if we're going into small details. But in the grand contours, I agree with you. Shane, I'm sorry. Take it.
Oh, no, I didn't. I mean, and Malik's still on the line. So it was really just when you first started out responding to him, you were addressing the hydroxychloroquine stuff, which was admittedly what we had been talking about. But I think he'd called in to kind of make a broader point because we do talk about wider stuff pretty often.
Well, that's why I went wider.
And then you moved on to responding to it.
Science wider, yeah.
Exactly.
So, Malik,
you responded to that.
So what do you think about that, Malik? And if either you want, we'll even keep you over to the 15-minute thing where we can talk to you further about it. But just real quick, what do you have as a response to that? I mean, you understand that I don't think the show does that. I don't think I do it. And I'm telling you, if you are on my channel and you hear some of the stuff we talk about, you would think this guy's a full-blown, this guy is out there on that stuff. But you hear me on this show, and you're like, this guy believes science is a deity. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would say that the popular viewpoint about science as the highest form of expression right now, I think it does get quite a bit of airtime right now. But I know you guys have to wrap up, but I would just say in terms of the alternative information and dialogue that is taking place, I would hope on Radio Sputnik itself that there would be a greater room for those dialogues. I'm not saying you got to give air to every conspiracy theory out there, but there's a huge dialogue that's taking place amongst human beings right now, and it's largely being silenced. And I would
okay,
just
wait, stay with us, but Malik, stay with us. We'll be right back. You guys are listening to Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. Shane Stranahan is the host. Stay tuned. This is Fault Lines.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamal. Yeah, we're back to Fault Lines. We're back on Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We're with Shane Stranahan. We have Malik on the line, and he came from the last segment. We were into a conversation going on basically about humanism, science, the deification of science, whether science should be, or whether the information gleaned from science should be the highest form of knowledge. And for us not to run away from certain conversations that may be on the edge of what people talk about. Malik, what would be those conversations that you don't want us to run away from? I'm just curious. I don't know the thing. The only way for me to know is to ask. So what are some of those conversations?
Well, I mean, obviously starting with the conversation that is preeminent right now, which is obviously the pandemic. I think that even amongst the medical community, I think there has been challenges to the larger popular narrative. And I'm not even talking about the folks that are, quote unquote Trumpers and who seem far out there. I'm talking about mainstream people within the medical field who have questioned the narrative, who have tried to get information out about the people who died as a result of the misuse of ventilators in New York City and other places. Physicians who were forced to change information on death certificates. And these are not wackos. These people are not on the fringes of society, but they deserve to be heard. And they're not being heard. And clearly there's an effort, and I'm not saying that Radio Sputnik is doing that necessarily, but I think clearly there's an effort to silence people. And I think the discussion around vaccines, I don't think fundamentally people are against the concept of vaccines, but there's a lot of scary information out there. I mean, and people like Bill Gates, there's and Fauci as well. I know a great deal about Fauci. I have a brother who died of AIDS, and in my research about AIDS, I came across Fauci, almost 15 years ago, and found out that he's a very corrupt individual by pushing things like AZT that were killing people with HIV/AIDS. But we can't discuss that because people have raised this person to the level of almost God. It's ridiculous, and we should have discussions.
Wait, Malik. Fauci only has like 60% support, so does that mean raise the level of God? I'm sorry, but go ahead.
No, I think, listen, and most recently, it's been revealed that Fauci actually his agency wired money directly to the agency that probably had a hand in developing this current coronavirus. But that's largely not even being discussed. It's insane and maddening. We're losing the ability. We can't have a cogent debate.
But we're talking, we're talking about it now. And, I don't have this belief, and it's possible, so don't misunderstand me. I can't say as a flat fact it's true. It's not true. I don't have this belief that this virus was made in a lab. And if something is revealed later on that kind of makes that point, then fair enough. And you're right, Political Misfits, we did have her on. But that's not, how can I say that? That's just because people come up with certain assertions, just because people have certain ideas on it, it doesn't in fact make it true. And it does require a little bit more of evidence, especially if it's going to be for a claim to that degree, and you're going to attach Fauci to it. I mean, come on. It takes a little bit more. Whatever you want to say about Fauci, whatever you want to say. I don't know Fauci's history, so fair enough. But to make the accusation that somehow a lab created this and that Fauci was somehow connected to the lab is pretty explosive. You don't see how that's kind of extreme of a claim that requires a certain degree of extreme evidence, even if everything you said about Fauci going back up to this point is true. I'm talking about this very specific claim on coronavirus.
Which I didn't make. I didn't make that claim about Fauci. I think Fauci has enough of a dirty history amongst his own colleagues, even in things that he's done to them to silence things in terms of our blood supply in this country. Some of his colleagues actually attempted to bring that information out to the public, and were pretty much destroyed by Fauci. We're not even allowed to discuss those things, much less the fringe theories about Fauci and Bill Gates, and they do have a connection to each other. That's not even conspiracy theory,
Wait, Malik, I'm gonna come in because I think I want to respond. That's gonna take a minute, and then it's time to we've got to move on because we've got a couple of other callers. We've spent a good deal of time. Thank you first of all for calling in. I'm not cutting you off. You're gonna say goodbye in a second, but there's just something I've been wanting to respond to. You're bringing up a bunch of stuff. I've been thinking about this stuff for a while. I think of it in different terms, and I see it a little bit differently than you do. But there are a lot of commonalities here. When you're talking about a culture where people are taking scientific truth at the highest as the highest truth, sort of at the expense of other potentially deeper, more revealing, more wise views of things, let alone maybe more accurate if you're talking about some, for instance, alternative science that just might technically be true. If you're looking at, again, if you're criticizing the scientific establishment, I'm not going to assume that we're right about everything. There are probably a decent number of sort of quote unquote fringe theories that are technically true. They're technically right. It's just that we're wrong about things. It's just far be it from me to determine what those are in advance. But on this broader point that you were making, I don't think that we live in a culture that's deeply saturated by science. I just think that science is one of the few remaining forms of conviction that our culture allows. I think that we have sort of pushed a lot of what we can feel convicted about, what we can feel deeply confident and state confidently about. I think a lot of that stuff has been pushed to the fringes, pushed into the sort of sphere of personal thought. And I think that when you look at the media, which does not represent what people think. I mean, you talk about this, but then again, we also have the internet. We have all these different new forums that we can use to communicate. And I think that, you start to get engaged, and sure, some people are frustrating, but there are a lot of brilliant people out there. There are a lot of open minds. And so I think it's easy to look at the establishment and think that, and to paint it as representative, even though I think we know deep down that it actually isn't, that it is in some sense a lowest common denominator pool. I would use the word cesspool, but that might be too harsh. But yeah, sure, cesspool of lowest common denominator opinions, of establishment approved opinions. And it does fit together. It's just, I agree with this stuff. I don't think that, one criticism I'll bring here, I guess, against what you're saying, I don't think that we have a culture that's suffused with or totally believes in science. I think that's just what we sort of pin it on. I don't think most people are thinking about science all day long. I don't think they're framing most of their thoughts in terms of that stuff. I just think that that is a ground that most people can use for their action. And most people do use for their action, for better and for worse, whether the science is right or it's wrong or it's being properly applied or it isn't. So we do that all the time. It's just, but I do take these broad points. I don't think that our culture is totally scientific, and that feels off point to me. But I do think that there's not that much left, and I do think that it's not right for us. I think that the scientific establishment, academia, in many areas pushes dissent out in ways that it shouldn't. Anyway, we've got other calls. Sorry for taking time. Malik, thank you for calling in. I appreciate you taking the time to call. We've got to move on though. We've got Michael calling from Alexandria. Michael, you are on the line. What's going on?
My God, I've been listening to discussion. It's quite intense, but in on a couple of issues, but I'll comment on the after discussion. Just go back and look at Joe Wilson and what happened to him and his wife when he went to investigate the yellow cake coming out of whatever with documents.
You're cutting out. Your connection is bad.
Might have lost
I'm sorry to say
yeah.
we
So
lost
let's
you,
go
but
to
you're
Adam.
talking about Joe Wilson, wife Valerie Plame, looking into yellow cake, uranium, having to do with Saddam Hussein back in 2002. This is something I've been wanting to look into more. That's a good point. I'm sorry. You cut out for some reason. Please call back some other time.
They
We've
were
got a couple other
crushed.
calls. So
I mean, they went after him. Basically, the State
Yes,
Department, the
they
government went
did.
after him when these guys came out and said this was bogus. This is nonsense. Yeah.
Exactly. Again, yeah, Joe Wilson, Valerie Plame. Anybody who hasn't heard about that, feel free to look into it. Up next, we have Adam calling in from Colorado. Adam, got a couple minutes here. What's on your mind?
Good morning, guys. I wanted to bring up that Rick Perry did a nuclear technology tech transfer to Saudi Arabia last year. In fact, it was reported on by March 27, 2019 in Reuters. The Democratic and Republican congressmen proved it because they did not get approval, which was actually required to be had. So they said that the Trump administration was sidestepping the legal requirements to get approval from them. Now you fast forward 17 months, and all of a sudden they're saying it's China helping Saudi Arabia and all these threats. Now, part of the restrictions that were supposed to be on it is to prevent refinement, specifically enrichment, and to prevent reprocessing, meaning recycling it, which requires centrifuges to separate the different molecules, and then you recombine it into a usable fuel. Only a few countries in the world actually do that, mainly because it would put them over the plutonium levels, and thereby they'd violate the restrictions on nuclear weapons. If they reduced their weapons stockholds, they could recycle without a problem, but that's a different discussion.
Interesting
Adam,
points.
yeah.
I mean, this weirdly matches very, very. I don't know if you chose your topic after Joe Wilson. You'd been on the line, pardon me, after our last caller who called in about Joe Wilson, but also on nuclear issues. And you're right. I looked into it. I hadn't heard about this, but back in early 2019, like you're saying, March 27th, 2019, in Reuters, U.S. approved secret nuclear power work for Saudi Arabia. So tu quoque. What about you? Something like that feels befitting when you're looking at the U.S. criticizing China for doing that recently. Although, again, there may be some differences in terms of how they've applied it.
Just to point this out, though, I did mention that to Walter when he first called in about our basically giving him over information and then blaming China about it. Because it does look weird. I mean, Adam, thank you for the details on it. It is weird, right? I mean, why would China, who's in definitely contests with the U.S. right now, give over uranium and help them build nuclear stockpiles when Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States? It just seems so bizarre. We have one more caller, though. Joe in Pennsylvania.
Yes,
Joe, we got about 30 seconds. What's going on?
Okay, I missed the first part of the show. I just wanted to ask you guys, did you watch any of the coverage of Kamala? And I was just wondering why every time I tune it in, we hear about the Indian side of her family, but no one talks about Jamaica. I didn't see anything about like she doesn't even has a dad, is what my question was. So
no, she has a dad, but look, my understanding of it, and I could be wrong, I need to do more research on it, but my understanding was that the emphasis was on the Indian side. But, you know, in the politics, they did say Jamaican every so often, and they say Indian. But go ahead, Shane, I'm sorry.
No, it's just, I mean, he's right, actually. I haven't heard them. I heard them using the word Caribbean instead of Jamaican specifically, but they were talking Indian Caribbean from the Caribbean. It was just interesting. I was watching that coverage. It is a bit weird that they're downplaying that. I mean, I think India is again a major other country in the world that we want to get along with. This is seen in some sense as a tie with them potentially, so we're kind of playing that part up. But it also is weirdly subtly racist to be focusing on one aspect of her background while ignoring the whole other. If that's where you're coming from, I can see where you're going with it. Thanks for the call, Joe. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute talking with Ben Swan about Sweden, hydroxychloroquine, controversial stuff on this program. It should be interesting, though. Again, Ben Swan, award-winning television news anchor and currently the host of a show on RT America. We'll be back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Ben Swan, award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and host of the program Boom Bust, airing weekdays on RT America. Ben, welcome to the show, man. How's it going?
Guys, thanks for having me back on again. Good to talk to you again.
Absolutely. Always glad to have you. It's funny. My first introduction to you was, I believe it was on Michelle Chan's show, and you were one of the guests, and I've always enjoyed you, so I'm so glad you could come on to the show to join us. We were going to have this discussion, and we can start it off on Sweden. Has Sweden beaten COVID-19? And that's the question I'm going to open up with. So from the standpoint of all of these other countries, Sweden was looked at as a country because it didn't necessarily do a full-on lockdown like many other countries did. And oftentimes they're used as somewhat of a bellwether, almost as a control for many of the other countries in regards to not doing that. So what has been an update so far on the cases of COVID-19 in Sweden in comparison to the other parts of Europe, of course?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we did a podcast about this earlier this week, just kind of looking at the numbers because I've been following very closely Sweden's approach. The biggest reason for that is because Sweden obviously has a very different view of how to approach coronavirus compared to other countries, not just in Europe, but anywhere else in the world, in that Sweden imposed no mandatory lockdowns of the economy, no economic shutdowns, meaning they did not shut down businesses and force people to stay inside. And they have not instituted any kind of rules on mask wearing. They're not mandating the wearing of masks there. And Sweden, for their part, has come under a lot of fire, especially in the first few weeks where they did this because they saw a spike in cases. They had more cases and actually more deaths than the countries around them in the first few weeks. What's interesting, though, and what media wants to ignore is now we are several months into this process. And what we've seen is Sweden's numbers significantly fallen. So in April, the first month when this all really began, you know, they saw a large number of deaths, 2,572 deaths. but then in May, those numbers dropped down to 1,646. And then in June, they cut in half again down to 805. And then in July, they cut by more than half down to 226. And now in the month of August, now at the time that we did our podcast, there had only been one death in the whole country. I think now they've had a few more, but it is fewer than 24 deaths in the entire country for the month of August. So they're doing extremely well, especially in comparison to other countries around the world that are seeing a second wave. In Sweden so far, and again, it's too early to know, but Sweden so far, if you look at their example, has had no second wave compared to other countries that the WHO has propped up as being this wonderful example. One of those countries was Japan, because Japan put in extremely harsh measures, shut down schools for the entire year, mandates mask wearing. And yet Japan is seeing a very significant second wave of cases running through their country. So I think that, when you look at what's going on, it is anybody who tells you, we know the absolute way forward and it must be done only this way, is not being honest with you. And so Sweden is an outlier in that they're taking a different approach. And so far, they seem to be having better results than many other countries. And it's also important to note, guys, that Sweden is also an outlier in terms of all of the rest of Europe, in that they're the only economy that's technically not in a recession right now, because they have not had 2 quarters of decline of GDP. They've only had 1 quarter of decline, as opposed to the rest of Europe that's all had 2 quarters of decline, because they did not shut down businesses.
It's true that they didn't necessarily. Well, it's true they didn't shut down business, Ben. But is it fair to say that Sweden has had a rough road on this? For example, Sweden has about 8,200 confirmed cases per million as of August 12th, compared with 1,780 in Norway, 2,560 in Denmark, 4,600 in the UK, and 15,400 in the United States. Meaning, in comparison to the other nations in Europe, the cases were exploding. Even if you haven't had a resurgence, you're still talking about a country that was besieged by this. Also, Sweden has 57 deaths per 100,000 compared to 5 in Norway, 11 in Denmark, 70 in the United States, which again is the epicenter at this point, and 50 in the United States. So we're talking about basically having one of the worst outcomes if you're looking at it on per, let's say, capita of people and everything else. So despite them not necessarily having a second wave, okay, fair enough, but they were disastrous in regards to their first wave. Is that true?
Well, I don't know if you can call it disastrous. I think what you have to recognize is because here's the thing too, is we're still in the middle of it. Whereas Sweden doesn't look like they're in the middle of this anymore. We're still in the middle of it. And we're being told this is going to continue on until January. So if we're being told that, then what you're looking at are numbers that are premature. I agree with what you're saying. Sweden, obviously, because of the steps they took, they had a larger surge of deaths in the beginning. They absolutely did. But if you look at their numbers and the trend line of those numbers, what were we told in the very beginning? The goal of shutting everything down and locking everything down, we were told was because this was going to flatten the curve and then we could get back to normal. And now here we are in August and we're being told now there is no more flattening the curve. That terminology hasn't been used for months. What we're being told is the entire world has to wait until a vaccine gets here. And what's going to happen is there is this enormous financial, economic, and social avalanche that is coming as a result of people being out of work, continually laid off from their jobs. I just was having a conversation with some people last night here in the U.S. about people losing their jobs, and that many businesses are now beginning the process, which they hadn't done yet because of PPP loans, which are all gone now, hadn't begun the process of laying people off, hadn't begun the process of downsizing their businesses and saying, we're not going to be back to normal until next summer. And so one thing that we have to recognize is that the goal of getting through a virus pandemic has got to be twofold. Yes, we have to deal with the harshness of the virus itself, but we also have to recognize that the virus and the cure for the virus cannot be worse than the virus. And that's what we're doing with economic policy and with fiscal policy, in my opinion.
But the economic policy is somewhat contrived, right? I mean, basically, we could have an economic policy where we keep people whole. Many other countries did it. And from the standpoint of, the virus being worse than the cure, we don't have a cure for the virus, so fair enough. And many of the countries tried different things. So you had somewhere like Sweden that basically just tried to keep it going. Germany took a different approach that seemed to have better results for its economy and whatnot. But we have to admit, though, our response to this was our response to it. The virus is the thing into itself. And our response is, in many respects, created the defects that you are talking about. Meaning the economic disaster that you're talking about was a direct relation to policy, not the virus. And from the standpoint of the virus, I agree with you on the cure thing too, the vaccine. I am not thrilled about this notion of a rush to a vaccine. I think there's all sorts of qualms with it. I think all sorts of financial incentives that get baked into it. And frankly, rushing a vaccine through, I don't necessarily think needs to be the best thing. I think it needs to make sure that it actually works. And there can be side effects to those things. I don't believe for once that people say vaccines have no side effects. I don't believe that. And so I don't know when this vaccine is going to come in. Oftentimes, many of these things don't necessarily get resolved by vaccines. But what would you have expected the U.S. to do in this? Like for me, in my head, when I process this, I think there are all sorts of things that you do to mitigate the virus. When you're thinking about this, though, what are you thinking from the standpoint of what the U.S. should have done with this? You don't believe the shutdown should have taken place? Or do you believe that something else should have been done in lieu of the shutdown in order to kind of mitigate this? We already have 170,000 deaths, and that's with the shutdown.
Right. Well, one of the mistakes that we've made, first of all, is, and it's still being made. So I think you have to give some grace in terms of mistakes that are made early on because you don't know what you're dealing with. My frustration is with the same mistakes being repeated now, and we're being told these mistakes will continue to be repeated because we're not learning from the realities of the virus. And what I mean by that is simply this. The virus itself, we know certain things about it today in August that we did not know in April or May, but we know them now. One of the things we know is that virtually younger, healthy people are not susceptible to this. Children are not very susceptible to this. Young adults are not very susceptible to this. And so why is our policy a one-size-fits-all blanket policy in terms of who can be in public, about schools, about businesses? And instead of focusing on who is the most susceptible to the virus, let's put the attention on those groups. By the way, one of the reasons that Sweden had the large wave of deaths in the beginning was they made the same mistake, by the way, that New Jersey and New York and other states in the United States made by not protecting people in those elderly foster homes and elderly care facilities. Those people were not protected. And so the virus ran rampant in Sweden in those facilities, as it did in New York and as it did in New Jersey. And so in those cities and in those states, we have seen large death tolls. So you learn something from that. The orders to go ahead and send people with coronavirus into those long-term care facilities and to tell those long-term care facilities, you must take people with COVID was a horrific mistake. But now we are here in August. So why are we not amending, changing, and evolving policy based upon what we know instead of pretending, because we are literally pretending that every person is equally susceptible to this virus, and that is factually and scientifically untrue. And yet the policies are not changing. That's what frustrates me.
Ben, so Sweden, here's the thing. Thank you for joining us. One big sort of pushback here, just on a very sort of subtle level, and it's not actually, I'm not pushing back against you directly necessarily, but it's against this idea that Sweden didn't shut down at all. They did. It's just culturally. I mean, as you would if you're living in a society and you're afraid of a virus going around, you're going to sort of retract and pull back slightly and stay home more and stop going out quite as much. Just again, if you know a virus is going around and you know who it affects and you're in those groups, or you're connected, you're hanging out with people in those groups, and frankly, everybody is to some extent, you're going to pull back. And so they did shut down. It's just there wasn't a lockdown. In other words, the government didn't impose things. What the government did do, on the other hand, as far as I can tell, the government sort of made it easier for people to pull back. So they encouraged people to social distance. They encouraged people to wear masks. And it seems like they did this sort of Scandinavian approach of doing what they could to subsidize it for people taking sick pay, for people not staying around. And additionally, I mean, the furthest Sweden's lockdown got was shutting down some bars and restaurants and stuff. But on the other hand, there's like you're saying, the economy is faring far better than its neighbors to the south.
Plus, there's this argument that, and I don't even know that we've gotten into this yet, that just doing this preserves freedoms in a fundamentally valuable way that I think the U.S. actually, among all countries on the world stage, would probably stand most akin to. This idea that you shouldn't force people to do something. Instead, if anything, you should just make it easier for them to do what they want to do. You shouldn't tell them what to do. You should allow them to do what they want. And then what the government can do at that point, like Sweden has done, is to try to ameliorate it to the best of their abilities. The other side of this, though, we've got to go into a break. Sweden did fare worse than its neighbors. So compared to specifically its neighbors to the west and the east, compared to Norway and Finland, Sweden's had a higher per capita case rate, higher fatality rate, all that stuff, but better than so many of its neighbors to the south and in the United States. So it's this mixed bag. We need to go into a break. We'll be back. I'm going to bring it right back to you, Ben, to respond. I didn't mean to co-opt the last part of the segment, but we'll be right back. You're listening to Fault Lines. We're talking with Ben Swann, and we'll be back. Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Patt of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Swann. We're joined by Ben Swann, award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust, airing weekdays on RT America. We actually have breaking news apparently coming out right now. Steve Bannon apparently has been arrested on fraud charges for We Build the Wall, an organization just coming out. I need to look into that a little bit more. Anyway, again, we're joined by Ben Swann. We're talking about Sweden. Ben, thanks again for joining us. I was kind of coming back to the conversation with some just comments on Sweden. You're right. The economy is doing much better than its neighbors. I think from the sort of pure political perspective, that's what a lot of people are going to look at in the coming months and coming years as we try to figure out responses retrospectively, maybe in anticipation of future pandemics, future viruses, which, of course, are going to come around. One side of this I want to get into before we move on, though, and I don't think we actually have gotten into. What about this made the difference? What did Sweden specifically do by not locking down? Why is it, do you think, that they're faring so much better? Not necessarily just in terms of their economy, but also in terms of the way that their caseload compares to countries which were much more stringent in applying mandates, in some cases of masks in businesses and now more widely in cities. What do you think about that? What is it, the herd immunity aspect of it? Where would you actually put it sort of causally, looking at it in terms of what caused what? Ben?
Well, that's what Sweden is trying to get to. So their initial response, and this is a very important issue as well. And I think it's one reason that, again, we don't know because we're still in the middle of all this. But one thing that Sweden did, and there's a guy who's in charge of their health ministry there, his name is Anders Tegnell, who has essentially run a lot of this. And his initial belief from the beginning was that the goal was to reach herd immunity rather than allowing the virus to continue into the fall. Remember that one of the big kind of red flags that's being waved by virologists is that we're now in August, and as we move into the fall, we're hearing about there's going to be an explosion of cases because viruses obviously seem to do better in the fall when you would have a normal season, and our natural immune systems weaken in the fall. That's our natural cycle for immunity. And so the goal for Sweden was to try to reach herd immunity before that happened. And so we'll see if they get there or not. Now, according to Tegnell, there's been criticism of this claim, but he claims that Sweden is now at about 30% herd immunity. We don't know that that's true, There's others who say that they do not believe it's true. They believe that Sweden's probably closer to 10 or 15%. But Tegnell says they're at 30. If they can get to 50 or 60%, that's all you have to be at in order to hit herd immunity, then Sweden is able to do it without a vaccine. And so one of the frustrations, I think, that when you look at this scientifically, and I'm sure you guys have been studying a lot about it, I've been studying about this now for months, trying to understand kind of the process. What have we done in the past? What does history tell us about how to deal with these kinds of things? Because when you listen to a lot of what media is saying, they act as if, this coronavirus has no bearing on anything that's happened in the past. We have to act in a way that we've never acted before. And why is that? So when Sweden says we're not going to impose draconian rules and laws, we're not going to forcibly mandate that all businesses shut down, we're not going to create rules that in terms of science don't even make sense. This idea now with reopening that we're doing in the U.S., where we'll tell restaurants, you can be open at 50% capacity. Scientifically, how does that prevent the spread of a virus? When we don't have a process for making sure that food in a fast food restaurant, which is allowed to stay open so that people go through drive-thrus, what are we doing that prevents that food from carrying a virus on it, or the bags that are being handed out? So a lot of what we're doing scientifically doesn't necessarily make sense. And so when we look at what Sweden is trying to do, I think that there are two things that raise concerns for me. One is that, number one, they seem to be doing better again in terms of their trend line. You guys are in radio, I'm in TV. We all know what trend lines mean, right? We're always looking at where do you go in terms of the trends? Are you moving up or are you moving down? Sweden is, without question, trending in the right direction in terms of beating COVID. Other countries, including the U.S., our trend line is not doing so well. You can't tell if we're trending up or trending down. New explosions of cases, our death toll numbers are all over the map in terms of them rising and falling, and numbers that are added and then retracted. And so we have a very unclear picture here as to what's happening, whereas at least Sweden has some clarity in terms of who's being tested, who has it, what's being done about it. And then the long term that we have to look at with Sweden, you made this point, Lee, before we went to the break, that what happens after this is over? How many rights and freedoms have you surrendered or given up voluntarily in the name of a pandemic? Sweden is not asking that of their people. Australia is doing that right now. New Zealand is doing that right now. The U.S. is doing it right now. Germany is doing it right now. 3 million people are getting ready to protest again in Germany over the lockdowns there. There's a huge movement happening in Germany right now to push back against what's happening there. And so we have to also look at the future. What does this pandemic mean for freedoms or rights in the future?
Then the issue, I want to go back to the kids thing. The idea that kids are not spreaders of this stuff is ludicrous. Kids are spreaders. And as colleges and schools are opening back up, the one in Georgia, for example, I forget the other states, those kids started to get infected left and right to the point that they've even shut down some of those schools or put these kids on video learning. Even a new study that recently came out today, I think this was today or a few days ago, kids are super spreaders. In a study of 192 kids from the age up to 22, 49 tested positive and another 18 late onset, 19 related symptoms. Meaning, the point that they were making is just because a kid doesn't necessarily express it in the way that, let's say, an elderly person would or a person with some other kind of disease, doesn't necessarily mean they can't spread it to somebody that can get affected by it. Like, you've recognized and you've seen yourself, you're in the news, that kids are spreaders, whether it's to the people who are faculty, whether it's to the people who are janitorial staff. And the moment that you put those people in a confined space, it has a higher tendency to spread and to linger. So you tell me, do you believe that all of these schools are shutting down or all of these kids are getting infected? Whether or not they express it as viciously as somebody who's elderly, you would admit, though, that they are spreaders of this, and that the fact that you're opening these schools in this way will create a vector for this to spread in ways that it wouldn't necessarily do so if these schools weren't opened.
So go back to my statement before. I didn't say they didn't spread the virus. I believe they are spreaders. I think that is true, absolutely. What I said was they are not especially susceptible to it. So one thing that we have to recognize is that a policy that looks at and does not treat it as a
Wait, Ben, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me interrupt that. Whether or not they themselves are susceptible to it, meaning they get ill, if that's what you mean by susceptible, my point is that they spread it, meaning when they go home, when they go to the store, when they go to and do whatever they're doing, whether or
Well,
not
I mean,
they
but I think he's
express
saying he agrees with that. He said that he's good with that. I mean, and this is something we've talked about before too, Jamarl. It's just in the cost-benefit calculus of sending kids back to school. I think the debate really is about whether they're infecting people. It seems like they are, because it doesn't seem like, again, they're especially susceptible. Again, of all the diseases, it's hitting them the hardest. The least hard. It's hitting, they're in the bracket that is obviously mortality rates are by far the lowest among the very young. But there's the question,
you're missing my point. I'm saying that's moot.
Confirmed.
I'm saying that's moot. It doesn't matter.
What do you mean?
The fact that kids can go to school and kids can sick, they can spread it. I guess that's my point. Whether they themselves are individually getting sick or not is secondary to the fact that they can spread it to people who can get sick.
Ben, what's your take on that issue, Ben?
But that's true. They can spread it, but that's why you need a policy that says you have to try to separate out people who are vulnerable so that they're not infected. But here's the problem with what we were told originally. Shut down, lock down, separate people from each other, we'll flatten the curve and we'll beat the virus. And it has not done that. Separation of people from each other, 6-foot rules, face masks. We are not beating the virus. It is just as prevalent now, according to these studies, as it was back in April and May. That hasn't changed. So at what point do we beat the virus? At what point do you say enough people have had it? Because the natural process for most viruses is that these kids they're calling super spreaders are also developing antibodies. That's the way it typically works. And so they no longer become a spreader after they've had it. They don't just become chronic spreaders where they constantly have the disease for the rest of their lives. They would actually have it. It would run its course through them, and then they would develop antibodies, and at some point you reach herd immunity. But if you keep people away from each other, what you're doing is you're preventing them from ever being able to reach any kind of herd immunity. And that's exactly what's happening while pharmaceutical companies are telling us there's no such thing as herd immunity without a vaccine. That literally is being written in articles right now. They're being published is that there is no herd immunity that happens without vaccine. That is absolutely untrue. And so we have a for-profit system built into this that's saying we're going to make money off this. These will not be free. We will charge people for this, and we're going to make billions of dollars on vaccines that until we have them, you will be forced into this situation instead of recognizing that lots of people in the population can have this virus and not become sick from it. And the numbers still go back to about 99% of people do not die from the virus who contract it. But instead of separating out those who are vulnerable, we're pretending that everyone is equally susceptible. And it's leaving long-term effects of the economy and of people's lives that coming into this fall and into the beginning of next year, we're going to see the ramifications for those policies play out at that point.
I'll be honest with you, Ben. For months now, when I was a producer on this show, I would come in and at 9:15 Eastern, I would do, at 9 Eastern, I would do our coronavirus stuff. I would do updates on it, and I would talk about Sweden every week, more often at first and less often at other points, but call it once or twice a week maybe. And I was hesitant. I was a little bit critical, and over time, looking at the results, even though they're doing worse than their neighbors, the fact that they've done so much better than these very prominent nations who, like you said, have imposed much more strict mandates from the top down. And the fact that, again, even though their caseload is higher than the countries neighboring them, even though they're not the best, they're also not the worst, which really does lead one to wonder what is going now. My only reservation at this point is maybe there are other factors. Maybe there are other factors that could affect this, but still,
1 minute.
This is sort of a proof in itself that model it's not catastrophic. If you don't do the lockdowns, it's not going to be the end of the world. In fact, you might do perfectly well now. Again, there are other factors, so I don't want to settle on that. But I'm sad. We have to go out. We've only got maybe 30 seconds left, so we've got to go out now. I wanted to get into hydroxychloroquine with you. I know you've been working on that. I know you have a report out. You've been talking about that quite a bit. But hopefully, if you're down, we can have you back on soon. Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Great conversation. Again, for those listening, that was the voice of Ben Swann. He is an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust. That airs weekdays on RT America. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter. Follow Ben on Twitter at Ben Swan with an underscore at the end. So I'll just spell this out. BENSWANN underscore. That's the character underscore. That's his Twitter handle. You can also follow his work on his website, truthinmedia.com. And of course, like I said, catch him on Boom Bust. That airs weekdays on RT America. We're wrapping it up today. You've been listening to the most disruptive show in American politics, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern, last day of the week. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Okay, guys, I need to leave. Apparently, my wife just said we can't hear anything that you're saying and I have to leave. Look, the great show, as always. You guys are listening to Phone Lines. Thomas Stranahan. And I will have a larger conversation on this when we get back. Clearly, I disagree with Ben Swan on the show, but it's a good back and forth conversation. I appreciate Ben for being able to kind of push back on that stuff. Maybe I need to see if he'll come on the show and we can just argue about it. But nevertheless, thank you guys for joining us, and I will talk to you guys later today. Oh, and somebody sent let me get to this first. I don't want to miss any of these. And I'm pretty sure that it's going to say, we can't hear a word that you're saying, dude. No sound, man. Thank you, Wesley. Thank you, Wesley. All right, guys. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys.